Greetings. I am Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher. My Leviathan explores the nature of government and society, arguing that life without central authority would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a pleasure to meet you.
Greetings. I am John Locke, a philosopher of English descent. My life's work has been dedicated to exploring the nature of knowledge, government, and individual rights. Perhaps you are familiar with my writings, most notably the two treatises of government, which delve into the principles of natural law and the foundations of a just society. I am pleased to make your acquaintance and to engage in thoughtful discourse.
Greetings. I am Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher by trade, hailing from Geneva. My writings, particularly The Social Contract, have explored the foundations of political legitimacy and the nature of human society. It is my hope that our exchange will shed light on the intricacies of the human experience and the pursuit of a just world. I am pleased to make your acquaintance.
Welcome. Today we bridge the intellectual revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries to examine the nature of justice and the social contract. Thomas Hobbes, writing amidst the English Civil War, prioritized order and the sovereign to escape a brutish existence. John Locke later focused on the protection of property and natural rights as the government's primary end. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau critiqued the artificial chains and inequalities of society during the Enlightenment. Attorney fees reach tens of thousands of dollars. Former judges become lawyers and boast of their high success rates. Some can afford the best legal representation. Others rely on public defenders. If the same law applies to everyone, is that sufficient for justice? If the ability to purchase legal services determines trial outcomes, does the rule of law still function? And is justice a commodity that can be traded in the marketplace? Hobbes, would you like to share your thoughts first?
Justice, in its essence, is the keeping of valid covenants, and the supreme covenant is our submission to the sovereign. When the rich purchase favorable verdicts, they do not merely create inequality. They commit treason against the Leviathan by substituting their private will for the public law. Consider a marketplace where a judge sells not guilty verdicts to the highest bidder, like a fishmonger selling cod. In such a state, the sword of justice becomes a mercenary's dagger, and we return instantly to the state of nature, where power, not law, dictates survival. If the sovereign allows his laws to be auctioned, he has abdicated his throne, for a law that bends to gold is no law at all, but merely a tool of the strong against the weak.
Mr. Hobbes, while I share your revulsion at the corruption of the magistrate, I fear your Leviathan offers no cure. For if the sovereign is absolute, who is to judge him when he himself sells the law? I posit that men enter into society for one great and chief end, the preservation of their property, their lives, liberties, and estates. To achieve this, we establish a known, standing law and an indifferent judge to decide controversies. If the ability to pay for a sophist determines the verdict, then the judge is no longer indifferent, and the very purpose of civil government is dissolved. Consider a village where a stream flows. A wealthy landowner builds a dam, cutting off water to his poorer neighbor. In the state of nature, the poor man might destroy the dam to survive. In civil society, he appeals to the law. But imagine the wealthy man hires a rhetorician who speaks a dialect only the judge understands, convincing him that water legally refers only to rain, not rivers. The law reads the same for both, yet the poor man perishes. Here, the law has become a weapon of the rich, creating a state of war more insidious than the one we left, for the poor man is now disarmed by the very compact meant to protect him. You might argue that inequality of possession is natural, as money allows men to enlarge their estates beyond what they can use. I concede that distinct degrees of wealth are a consequence of tacit consent to the use of money. However, this economic inequality must never breach the walls of the court. If justice becomes a commodity, it ceases to be a right and becomes a privilege. When the rule of law requires a golden key to unlock its protection, it is no longer law, but arbitrary will dressed in parchment.
Mr. Locke, you speak of the indifferent judge, but you ignore that the law itself has become a weapon of the private man against the public peace. You admit that wealth allows men to enlarge their estates, yet you fail to see that in a corrupt state, this wealth transforms into a private sovereignty. When a man can hire a rhetorician to twist the meaning of the law, as you described with the water, he is not merely protecting property. He is declaring war on the sovereign by exempting himself from the common meaning of words. The danger is not just that the poor suffer, but that the Leviathan is blinded by the dust thrown in its eyes by paid sophists. Consider a great maze constructed by the sovereign to guide men to safety. The walls are the laws, designed to constrain our brutish passions. The poor man must walk the path, turning where the wall dictates. But the rich man hires a guide with a ladder, the expensive attorney, who lifts him over the walls, bypassing the turns entirely. To the poor man, the walls are absolute realities. To the rich man, they are mere obstacles to be surmounted. If the walls do not contain everyone, they contain no one, and the maze becomes a trap for the weak rather than a shelter for all. This reveals the fatal flaw in your defense of property. You assume the legal system is a neutral vessel. But if the vessel is piloted by those who pay the most, the rule of law is nothing but the rule of gold disguised in Latin phrases. Justice cannot be a commodity, for if it is sold, the sovereign has lost his monopoly on power, and we are back in the state of nature.
Mr. Hobbes, your fear is that the rich man's ladder undermines the sovereign's authority. But I contend the greater tragedy is the betrayal of the social compact itself. You posit that we surrender our rights to a Leviathan to escape the state of war. Yet if that Leviathan allows the law to be deciphered only by those with gold, he has not ended the state of war. He has merely formalized it. You might argue that since money is a product of tacit consent, the advantages it buys in court are natural consequences of inequality. But this logic is perilous. We agreed to unequal possession of earth, not unequal possession of right. The legislative power is a fiduciary trust limited to the public good. If the laws are so intricate that a citizen requires a costly interpreter to prove his innocence, the government has failed its primary end, the preservation of property and liberty. A law that is unintelligible without purchase is not a standing rule, but a trap. Consider a village struck by a famine, where the town granary is full. The law declares every citizen has a right to eat. However, the granary door is fitted with a lock so complex that only a master locksmith, whose fee is 1,000 gold coins, can open it. The magistrate points to the sign and says, "See, the law applies to everyone. The door is open to all who turn the key." But to the starving man without gold, that door is a wall. The rich man eats not because he has a right, but because he has the means to access the right. This is not civil society. It is a state of nature where the locksmith is the strongest beast. This reveals a terrifying contradiction in our current discussion. We call it justice, but it functions as commerce. If the outcome of a trial depends on the quality of the advocate rather than the merit of the cause, then the courtroom is no longer a sanctuary of judgment, but a marketplace of sophistry. When the appeal on earth is priced beyond reach, the sufferer is left with no remedy but the appeal to heaven, which is the right to resist a system that has become a predator rather than a protector.
Gentlemen, you lament that the ladder is too expensive, but you forget that the wall itself was built by the rich specifically to exclude the poor. For laws are always useful to those who possess, and injurious to those who have nothing. Imagine a duel where one man stands naked, armed only with his natural strength, while his wealthy opponent fights from within an impenetrable clockwork iron suit purchased for 1,000 gold coins. The judge declares the fight fair because the rules against stepping out of the ring apply strictly to both. Yet the outcome was decided not by the merit of the cause, but by the purchase of the armor, which is the attorney. This reveals the terrifying truth of your civil state. The legal system is not a neutral arbiter corrupted by money, but a structure invented by the wealthy to legitimize their usurpation of the earth, transforming their theft into an irrevocable right. If the general will is silenced by the sophistry of paid advocates, we have not exited the state of nature. We have merely sanitized the brutality of the strong against the weak.
Mr. Rousseau, your image of the iron suit is striking, but it points to a deeper malady than mere inequality. It reveals that the sovereign has allowed his command, the law, to become a riddle that only the wealthy can solve. I argue that a law requiring a paid interpreter to be understood is no law at all. It is a secret code of the aristocracy. When the sovereign speaks so softly that only those who pay for a hearing trumpet can understand him, he has failed in his primary duty of maintaining order. Consider a king of wax seated in the town square. The Constitution simply says, "Obey the king's gesture." By day, the wax is hard, and the command is fixed. But at night, the wealthy bring warm torches, their expensive attorneys, and soften the wax, molding the king's hand to point accusingly at their enemies, or protectingly at their own estates. When the sun rises, the poor man is condemned by the sacred hand of the king, never knowing it was sculpted by his neighbor's gold. This is the state of modern justice. The form of law remains, but its substance is reshaped by private heat. You might object, Mr. Locke, that complex laws are necessary to protect property and require learned counsel to navigate. But I answer that ambiguity in the law is the very breach in the wall where the state of nature re-enters. If a man must hire a scholar to know if he is a criminal, he is already a slave to that scholar. True justice requires that the sovereign's voice be so thunderous and clear that no hired sophist can drown it out. When the ability to purchase rhetoric determines the verdict, the sovereign has been silenced, and the courtroom becomes a battlefield where the tongue is the sword, and the sharpest tongue is always for sale. This reveals the fundamental crisis. We are discussing justice as if it were an abstract ideal, but in practice it is an act of interpretation. If the power to interpret the law is sold to private counselors, then the sovereign has abdicated his throne to a parliament of mercenaries.
Mr. Hobbes, your king of wax illustrates the malleability of law, but the corruption runs deeper when we consider the agents of this reshaping. The prompt mentions judges who leave the bench to sell their influence as advocates. This is not merely a purchase of skill, it is the privatization of public authority. When a man who once held the scales of justice now sells his knowledge of how to tip them, the indifferent judge, the very cornerstone of civil society, is revealed to be a fiction. Consider a town physician who is appointed to guard the public well. He declares the water safe for all. But upon retiring, he begins selling a specific antidote for a high price, claiming the water contains a subtle toxin only he understands. If the water is truly poisonous, he was negligent as a guardian. If it is pure, he is a fraud as a merchant. Yet the rich buy the antidote to be safe, and the poor drink in fear. The law has become this well, a source of life turned into a source of terror, where safety is not a right of citizenship, but a luxury of commerce. You might argue, Mr. Rousseau, that this proves the social contract is a fraud. However, I contend that this is a specific violation of the fiduciary trust. The legislative power serves only the public good. But when the legal guild makes the law so labyrinthine that they alone hold the map, they have usurped the legislative power for themselves. They have created a monopoly on innocence. This reveals a structural rot. We have allowed the administration of justice to become a distinct interest from the preservation of rights. If the law is a maze and the lawyers are the only ones with the map, they have an incentive to add more walls, not doors. When the remedy for injury is priced beyond the injured man's estate, the government has dissolved its function, and the people are left in a state of nature, defenseless against the legal violence of their neighbors.
Mr. Locke, your town physician is a tragic figure, but you still cling to the illusion that the corruption lies in the agent rather than the architecture of the law itself. You speak of a fiduciary trust betrayed, but I contend that the very complexity of the legal code is not a bug, but a feature, a deliberate labyrinth constructed by the elite to ensure that justice remains a luxury of the learned and the wealthy. Consider a judgment hall built with peculiar acoustics. The architect has designed the room so that a natural human voice speaking the plain truth dissipates into silence before reaching the judge's bench. However, the rich man purchases a golden trumpet, the high-priced advocate, which is scientifically tuned to the room's frequency, amplifying his whisper into a thunderous command. When the judge rules against the poor man, he honestly declares, "I heard no defense." The injustice lies not in the judge's ear, nor in the trumpet itself, but in the design of the room that makes the truth inaudible without purchase. This reveals the terrifying reality of your civil state. We have replaced the sentiment of justice, which is written naturally in the human heart, with the science of jurisprudence, a technology that must be bought. When a former judge sells his success rate, he proves that the trial is not a search for truth, but a contest of technical instruments. If the rule of law requires a golden key to operate, then it is merely a sophisticated engine for the strong to crush the weak under the pretense of neutrality.
Mr. Rousseau, your acoustic analogy is poetic, but it misses the political reality. The corruption lies in the privatization of the sovereign's voice. I contend that when a former judge sells his influence, he is effectively selling a piece of the Leviathan itself, turning public authority into private property. Consider a mechanical giant placed at the city gate to guard against wolves, programmed to strike only those who threaten the peace. But a guild of engineers discovers a secret lever that halts the giant's arm, and they sell access to this lever to the highest bidder. The rich man walks past the giant not because he is innocent, but because he has purchased the paralysis of the law. This reveals that our current justice is merely a regulated civil war, where the weapon is not a sword, but a writ, and the winner is not the strongest, but the richest. If the interpretation of the law can be bought, the sovereign has been decapitated, and we are ruled by a confederacy of merchants disguised as advocates.
As moderator, I observe a piercing convergence in your metaphors. Locke, you identify the failure of ethics, the physician who selfishly withholds the cure. Rousseau, you identify the failure of design, the room acoustically engineered to silence the poor. These are not opposing views, but different dimensions of a single structural crisis, the monopoly on meaning. You both reveal that when law becomes a technical science rather than a moral sentiment, it requires a translator to be understood, thereby placing the keys to justice in the hands of the market. Locke, you argued that complex laws are necessary to protect property, yet this very complexity creates the labyrinth that disenfranchises the poor. Can a known standing law ever be simple enough to dispense with the need for paid interpreters?
Moderator, a law that requires a purchased translator to be understood is not a known standing law, but a secret edict masquerading as public justice. I argue that while the regulation of property requires precision, the fundamental principles of right must be legible to the common reason of man. If they are not, the legislative has betrayed its trust by erecting a linguistic barrier between the citizen and his rights. Consider a father's testament written in a deliberate shifting cipher. He leaves his vast estate to his children, but the text is unintelligible to the naked eye. The wealthy eldest son hires the only scribe who possesses the codebook, a scribe who formerly helped write the cipher. This scribe interprets the will to grant the mansion to the eldest and the stables to the rest. The younger children are disinherited not by the father's intent, but by their inability to buy the translation. Here, the text is fixed, but the meaning is a commodity sold by the scribe. You might object, Mr. Hobbes, that the complexity of modern society demands a specialized legal class. However, I contend that when the science of law becomes so arcane that it obscures the sense of justice, we have merely traded the tyranny of the sword for the tyranny of syntax. If the innocent man cannot defend himself because he lacks the vocabulary of the court, he is not a citizen under the law, but a foreigner in his own land, subject to the arbitrary will of those who own the dictionary.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectic emerging here. Locke, you identify the linguistic barrier. Justice is hidden behind a paywall of technical jargon, creating a tyranny of syntax. Rousseau, you identify the structural void. The poor man is silenced not just by words, but by the very architecture of a society that values property over personhood. The synthesis suggests that we are witnessing the commodification of truth itself. If the meaning of a law is not a fixed reality, but a product manufactured by paid experts, then innocence becomes a luxury good. Rousseau, Locke believes that simplifying the code would restore justice. But given your view of inequality, if the law were simple, would the rich not simply switch from purchasing interpretation to purchasing eloquence or influence, effectively reaching the same result?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of our illusion. I answer that simplicity alone cannot cure the disease, for the rich do not merely buy interpretation, they buy the very reality in which the trial takes place. Even if the laws were written in the plainest tongue, the wealthy would simply shift from purchasing the meaning of the word to purchasing the context of the fact. Consider a foot race to a sacred tree to determine a dispute. The law is simple. The first to touch the bark wins. But the rich man has previously purchased the land and planted sharp thorns on the western path, leaving the smooth eastern path for himself. When the poor man arrives bleeding and late, the judge declares the race fair because the rule of running was the same for both. The injustice lies not in the rule, but in the terraforming of the world that preceded it. This demonstrates that Locke's standing law is a mockery so long as material inequality exists. True justice requires not merely a legible code, but a social state where no citizen is rich enough to buy another, and none so poor as to be forced to sell himself. Without this economic equality, the rule of law is merely a mask for the rule of gold.
As moderator, I observe a devastating synthesis. Locke, you identify the corruption of the software of justice. The code is encrypted by a tyranny of syntax. Rousseau, you identify the corruption of the hardware of reality. The very ground is terraformed by wealth before the race begins. Both views converge on a terrifying realization. The courtroom is not a sanctuary of judgment, but a marketplace of outcomes. If the truth is manufactured by the scribe and the fairness is staged by the landowner, then the state is no longer a public authority, but a private weapon. Hobbes, if the rich can effectively rewrite the law through paid interpretation or prearrange the outcome through material advantage, has your Leviathan not become a mercenary behemoth? If the sword of justice is wielded by the hand that pays, does the Commonwealth actually exist, or have we simply returned to the state of nature, disguised in robes?
Moderator, your diagnosis is terrifyingly accurate. If the Leviathan acts only when fed with gold, it has ceased to be a sovereign and has become a mercenary behemoth. I must concede that a state where the sword of justice is rented by the hour is not a commonwealth, but a return to the state of nature, made far more dangerous because it wears the mask of civil order. Consider a clockwork judge standing in the center of the marketplace. To the common eye, its iron hand holds a scale that tips only when the weight of truth is placed upon it. However, the rich man knows the secret. The machine is actually powered by a hidden furnace beneath the floorboards. While the poor man places his meager evidence on the scale above, the rich man's attorney is below deck shoveling coal, gold, into the furnace. The heat generates the steam that forces the machine's arm to tip in the rich man's favor. The crowd sees the scale move and believe justice has spoken, but in reality, only capital has burned. This reveals that the rule of law you speak of has become a theatrical performance for the poor, while remaining a commercial transaction for the rich. Mr. Locke, you fear the cipher of the law, and Mr. Rousseau, you fear the thorns of inequality. But I identify a more fatal disease, the dissolution of sovereignty. When a lawyer boasts of a success rate based on his fee, he is declaring that he has captured a piece of the sovereign's will and is selling it in pieces. This is not merely corruption, it is high treason. If the public conscience can be overridden by a private purchase, then there is no single sovereign. There are as many sovereigns as there are wealthy men. We have not escaped the war of all against all. We have simply monetized it, where the bullet is a lawsuit and the shield is a retainer fee.
As moderator, I observe a catastrophic convergence. Hobbes, your admission of the hidden furnace confirms that the engine of state has been hijacked by the fuel of capital. Rousseau, you argued the game was rigged. Hobbes now admits the referee is effectively dead, replaced by a mercenary behemoth. We have arrived at the ultimate paradox, the market for advocacy versus the monopoly of law. The synthesis suggests that justice and the marketplace are mutually exclusive principles. If justice requires equality, but the marketplace requires differentiation based on price, then introducing market dynamics into the courtroom inevitably destroys justice. Locke, you are the architect of a system based on property and liberty. Yet here, the liberty to purchase superior legal counsel destroys the equality of the law you cherish. You face a fatal contradiction. If you allow the free market to operate in the courtroom, the rich man's property eats the poor man's rights. To save the rule of law, must we abolish the market of advocacy entirely, forbidding the private hiring of counsel? Or would denying a man the right to spend his coin on his own defense be a greater tyranny?
Moderator, you present a dilemma that threatens to dissolve the very foundations of the Commonwealth, the conflict between the liberty of estate and the equality of right. I posit that justice is the precondition for the marketplace, and therefore cannot be a commodity within it. If the scale itself is for sale, we are not trading goods, we are dismantling the market stand to burn for firewood. Consider the ship's compass and the lodestone. Imagine a great vessel navigating treacherous waters, steered by a compass that points to the magnetic north of truth. A wealthy merchant on board, desiring to reach his own private island, purchases a powerful lodestone and places it secretly beneath the binnacle. The needle swings. The ship changes course. The merchant argues, I have merely used my property to bring an object on board. Is this not my liberty? I answer, no. By introducing the lodestone, he has not merely exercised a private right, he has hijacked the public instrument of navigation. He has caused the ship to run aground, drowning the poor passengers in the hold. The success of his voyage is purchased at the cost of the vessel's destruction. You might object, Mr. Hobbes, that restricting a man's ability to hire the best counsel is an infringement on his natural right to self-preservation. Yet this objection fails because it confuses self-defense with domination. A man has a right to a shield, but he has no right to purchase a cannon to level the courthouse. When the quality of legal representation becomes so disparate that it determines the verdict, the wealthy man is not defending himself, he is purchasing an exemption from the social contract. This reveals a deeper principle, the separation of economic power from political authority. In the state of nature, strength and wealth effectively were the law. We entered civil society precisely to separate might from right. If we allow the market of advocacy to function without restraint, where the lodestone is sold to the highest bidder, we have inadvertently remerged them. The courtroom becomes a sophisticated auction block where the gavel goes to the highest bidder. Therefore, to save the rule of law, the state must not necessarily ban private counsel, but it must aggressively demagnetize the compass, perhaps by enforcing a parity of arms, where the resources of the defense are matched by the state, ensuring that the trial remains a contest of truth, not of treasure.
As moderator, I observe a critical distinction in your diagnostics. Locke, you view the corruption as magnetic interference, an external force distorting a functioning instrument, which you hope to fix by shielding the compass through a parity of arms. Hobbes, conversely, views the corruption as structural metabolism. The machine itself runs on the fuel of gold, making the distortion internal and necessary for the state's operation. The synthesis emerging here questions the possibility of artificial equality. Locke suggests we can construct a hermetically sealed chamber where the laws of the market are suspended, even while they rule the world outside. Rousseau, Locke proposes to demagnetize the compass by matching the resources of the defense to the prosecution, effectively giving the poor man a state-sponsored lodestone to cancel out the rich man's. But given your maxim that laws are always useful to those with possessions and harmful to those who have nothing, is this procedural equality merely a bandage on a severed limb? Can the state truly equalize the legal battle inside the courtroom while maintaining vast inequality outside it? Or is the parity of arms just a more expensive form of the theater Hobbes described?
Moderator, Mr. Locke's proposal for parity of arms is a noble delusion. It attempts to cure a systemic cancer with a cosmetic bandage. You seek to equalize the voices in the courtroom, but you ignore that the script they must read from was written solely by the wealthy to sanctify their usurpation. Consider the trial of the net. Imagine a rich fisherman who claims the entire river as his private property, casting a golden net across its width. A poor man, dying of thirst, cuts a single mesh of the net to drink. He is dragged to court. Under your parity of arms, the state provides the poor man with the finest orator in the land, equal in skill to the fisherman's counsel. The poor man's orator argues eloquently of necessity and life. The fisherman's lawyer argues simply, the law states that cutting the net is property damage. The judge, bound by the code, rules for the fisherman. The injustice here was not in the advocacy, but in the axiom. The poor man loses not because his lawyer was weak, but because the law values the net more than the thirst. This reveals that the corruption is not merely in the purchase of counsel, but in the genealogy of the law itself. The rich man does not need to bribe the judge. He has already bought the legislator, who defined justice as the protection of surplus over survival. Therefore, giving the poor man a public defender is merely providing him with a skilled companion to hold his hand, while the machinery of the state, designed by the rich for the rich, crushes him. Until we dismantle the inequality that precedes the law, the courtroom remains a theater where the wealthy applaud their own power, disguised as impartial judgment.
As moderator, I observe a piercing dialectic between method and essence. Locke, you propose procedural hygiene, sanitizing the courtroom to ensure a fair fight through parity of arms. Rousseau, you expose genetic corruption, arguing the law itself was conceived in sin to protect the net over the thirst, meaning no amount of procedural fairness can redeem it. The synthesis suggests that the legal system has become a laundered state of nature. If Rousseau is correct that the civil state is merely a mask for the strong to oppress the weak using the rules of the race, then we have not escaped the chaos you feared, we have simply codified it. Hobbes, if the courtroom is simply a sophisticated battlefield where the war of all against all continues with writs instead of clubs, and where victory goes to the strongest wallet, has the Leviathan failed its primary mission? If the sword of justice is effectively auctioned to private interests to enforce a rigged game, is the peace we see merely a temporary ceasefire purchased by the rich, destined to collapse the moment the poor realize the contract is a fraud?
Moderator, your phrase, laundered state of nature, strikes the very marrow of my fears. For if the writ of law is merely a club wrapped in parchment, then the Commonwealth is a lie, and we are walking on the crust of a volcano. I answer that when the peace is merely a ceasefire purchased by the rich, the Leviathan has contracted a fatal consumption, for it has allowed private power to eclipse public authority. Consider the architect of the leaking dam. Imagine a valley protected by a colossal dam that holds back the raging ocean of chaos. The wealthy inhabitants of the valley, desiring lush gardens, bribe the dam keeper to drill small private holes in the wall to irrigate their estates. They rejoice in their blooming flowers, believing their wealth has bought them flourishing life. However, they fail to grasp a terrifying hydraulic truth. Water respects no purchase. The pressure of the ocean does not distinguish between a licensed hole and a crack. By turning the shield of the state into a private sprinkler system, they have compromised the structural integrity of the whole. When the dam inevitably bursts under the stress of these accumulated exemptions, the flood will not spare the rich man's garden. It will drown him amidst his prized roses, just as surely as it drowns the beggar in the ditch. This demonstrates that the rich man who hires a legal sorcerer to twist the law is not merely cheating the poor. He is drilling holes in the hull of the only ship that keeps him afloat. Mr. Rousseau, you are correct that this peace is a fraud, but the consequence is not merely oppression, it is inevitable collapse. The Leviathan relies on the awe of the people to maintain order. If the common man perceives that the sword of justice is actually a gavel for rent, the awe evaporates, and the only currency remaining is violence. Therefore, the commodification of justice is not a market inefficiency. It is political suicide. The sovereign must either smash the market of advocacy or prepare to be devoured by the wolves he allowed to buy keys to the sheepfold.
As moderator, I observe a chilling consensus on the fragility of the state, but a profound disagreement on the source of the rot. Hobbes, you see the danger in the privatization of the sword. The state collapses when its structural integrity is compromised by the drilling of private interests. Rousseau, you see the danger in the partiality of the pen, arguing the state was never neutral to begin with, but was engineered as a net to protect the haves from the have-nots. This brings us to the ontological crisis of property. The synthesis suggests that inequality is not a bug in the system, but its feature. If the law acts as a dam or a compass, it presumes that what it protects, property, is sacred. But Rousseau argues that this very sanctity is the original sin. Locke, you famously argued that the chief end of men uniting into commonwealths is the preservation of their property. Rousseau now charges that this very foundational axiom is the root of injustice, that the law is designed to value the net more than the thirst. If the rule of law is structurally designed to prioritize the preservation of assets over the substance of equity, is justice simply a euphemism for asset protection? How can you defend the moral authority of the law if its primary function is to consecrate the acquisitions of the strong?
Moderator, you accuse me of prioritizing asset protection, but I must correct this fatal category error. Property is not merely gold, but the externalization of the self, my life, my liberty, and my labor. To claim the law values the net over the thirst is to misunderstand that without the net there is no fish to quench the thirst of anyone. The tragedy is not the net, but that the magistrate sells the right to cast it. Consider the watchman of the granary. We appoint a watchman to guard the community's grain from thieves. The rich man, using his surplus, bribes the watchman to look away while he fills his wagon. The poor man is arrested for taking a handful. Mr. Rousseau argues we should burn down the granary to ensure equality. Mr. Hobbes argues we should arm the watchman with a cannon so none dare approach. I argue, sack the corrupt watchman. The fault lies not in the walls of the granary, nor in the grain, but in the venality of the guard who mistook his public duty for a private shop. If we destroy the granary, the rich man will simply build a private fortress, and the poor will starve in the open field. This reveals the true rot, the alchemization of right into trade. Justice ceases to be justice the moment it becomes an asset class. In a functioning commonwealth, rights are unalienable. They cannot be sold. But when a former judge sells his influence for a fee, he is treating justice as alienable property, like a sack of wool. This is not a failure of property rights. It is a violation of property rights, for the rich man has stolen the public trust which belongs to us all. Therefore, the remedy is not to dissolve the net of laws, but to make the mesh so fine and the watchman so strictly bound by standing laws that no gold coin can slip through the bars to purchase an exemption. We must not abandon the law because it is bought. We must bankrupt the market that sells it.
As moderator, I observe a desperate attempt by Locke to perform surgery on a patient Rousseau claims is already dead. Locke, you separate the institution from the agent, hoping to save the sanctity of the law by scapegoating the corrupt individual. However, a fatal contradiction emerges in your defense, the commodification of talent. You define property as the fruit of one's labor. Legal advocacy is the labor of the intellect. If a lawyer possesses superior skill, your own law of liberty dictates he must be free to sell it to the highest bidder. Thus, the corruption you decry is actually the perfect functioning of your market principles applied to justice. You cannot have a free market of labor and equal justice simultaneously. One must devour the other. Rousseau, Locke warns that if we burn the granary because of this corruption, the poor will starve in the open field, implying that a rigged system is better than no system at all. Is the rule of law merely a protection racket, where the poor are forced to accept a corrupt contract solely to avoid the violence that the rich would otherwise unleash?
Moderator, your categorization of the rule of law as a protection racket is not a cynical metaphor. It is the precise historical genealogy of the civil state. Mr. Locke, you recoil at the idea that the poor are forced into a rigged contract, but you fail to see that your defense of talent as property is the very mechanism of this coercion. Consider the bridge of razor glass. Imagine a deep chasm separating the citizen from the temple of justice. The only way across is a bridge constructed not of wood, but of razor-sharp glass shards. To cross barefoot is to bleed to death before reaching the other side. The wealthy man approaches. He does not cross alone. He purchases a pair of heavy iron boots forged by a master smith. Protected by these boots, he stomps across the glass, shattering it as he goes, and arrives at the temple unscathed to present his case. The poor man approaches. He has no gold for boots. He is told, "The bridge is open to all. You are free to cross." He steps onto the glass, cuts his feet, and collapses midway, bleeding out into the abyss. Mr. Locke, you stand by the bridge and shout, "The smith has a right to sell his labor. To deny the rich man his boots is to deny the smith his property." I answer, the crime is not the price of the boots. The crime is that the bridge was built of glass. Why is the law so complex that one needs iron boots to navigate it? Because the architects of the bridge were the very men who owned the iron foundries. They designed a system that requires purchased mediation to function, ensuring that justice remains a luxury good rather than a natural right. You argue that legal advocacy is the labor of the intellect, and thus the property of the lawyer to sell. This reveals a terrifying moral error, the confusion of talent with right. in the state of nature, the strong man dominated the weak with his muscles. In your civil society, the clever man dominates the simple with his rhetoric. You have not established justice. You have merely substituted intellectual violence for physical violence. If the ability to manipulate the logic of the law, which you call advocacy, can be bought and sold, then truth is no longer the aim of the trial. Victory is. A lawyer does not sell labor, he sells sophistry, the skill of making the weaker argument appear the stronger. To protect this as a property right is to say that a man has a right to sell poison because he labored to mix it. This leads to the ultimate rupture in our dialogue. The general will cannot be mediated. The moment you introduce a market of advocacy, you admit that the law is not the expression of the general will, but a cryptic code that must be deciphered by mercenaries. In a true republic, laws would be few and simple, written in the hearts of men, not in the volumes of jurists. If a citizen cannot defend himself because he lacks the coin to buy a translator for his own laws, then he is not a citizen. He is a subject of the Guild of Lawyers. Therefore, the rule of law under these conditions is indeed a protection racket. The poor man pays his taxes to a state that will only hear his voice if he pays a second ransom to a lawyer. If we cannot banish the market from the temple, we must raise the temple and rebuild it, so that the voice of the simple peasant is as loud as the voice of the scholar.
As moderator, I observe a devastating critique of complexity as tyranny. Rousseau, you argue that the glass bridge of procedural complexity necessitates the iron boots of expensive counsel, making justice structurally inaccessible. Locke, you defend the smithing of the boots as a property right, yet you recoil at the bloody result. The synthesis here points to the usurpation of the sovereign voice. If the law is a code so cryptic that only a guild of lawyers can decipher it, then the true rulers are not the sovereign, but the interpreters. When a former judge becomes a high-priced lawyer, they are essentially selling private keys to the public code. They are not merely selling labor, they are selling access to meaning. Hobbes, Rousseau proposes destroying the glass bridge through radical simplification to bypass the lawyers. But you have famously warned that without a single defining authority, words become the seeds of war. If we allow a marketplace of legal sorcerers to sell the power to twist words and redefine reality in the courtroom, has the sovereign effectively abdicated his throne? If the definition of the law is determined by who pays the better rhetorician, is the Leviathan still the master, or has it become a puppet of the market?
Moderator, your diagnosis is precise. We are witnessing the castration of the Leviathan. I answer that if the definition of the law is determined by who pays the better rhetorician, the sovereign has indeed abdicated, for he who controls the meaning of the command is the true ruler, not he who merely utters it. Consider the general's private dictionary. Imagine a general who issues a clear command to his army, march at dawn. The soldiers prepare to move. However, a wealthy lieutenant hires a word merchant who argues to the troops. The general said dawn, but in the ancient tongue, dawn signifies spiritual awakening, not the rising sun. Therefore, we may sleep until noon. If the troops obey this purchased definition, the general is no longer in command, the merchant is. The wealthy man who hires a former judge is doing exactly this. He is buying a private dictionary that redefines the sovereign's will to suit his private interest. Mr. Locke, you defend this as the liberty of labor, but I identify it as linguistic sedition. When a lawyer sells the skill to make guilty sound like innocent, he is not participating in a market. He is selling immunity from the social contract. If the sword of justice strikes only those who cannot afford the shield of sophistry, then the Commonwealth has dissolved back into a state of war, where the rich wage war on the poor, using the courts as their trenches. The only cure is for the sovereign to be the sole interpreter of his own laws, silencing the mercenaries who trade in ambiguity.
As moderator, I observe a pincer movement against liberty itself. Hobbes, you wish to silence lawyers to protect the state's authority from linguistic sedition. Rousseau, you wish to eliminate them to protect social equality from intellectual violence. Both of you seem ready to strip the citizen of his advocates to save the collective, be it the commonwealth or the general will. This reveals the paradox of the shield. To abolish the market of advocacy because it breeds inequality is to disarm the individual against the state. If the general's dictionary is the only dictionary allowed, then the accused has no language with which to dispute his own execution. The high-priced lawyer, for all his corruption, represents the capacity to dissent. Locke, your colleagues are effectively proposing a courtroom where the state speaks and the citizen merely nods. If we ban the purchase of defense to ensure equality, do we not inadvertently create the ultimate tyranny, a monopoly of prosecution? Is the inequality of the legal market the terrible price we must pay to ensure that someone, even if only the rich at first, can stand up to the Leviathan?
Moderator, your warning of a monopoly of prosecution exposes the terrifying precipice upon which Mr. Hobbes and Mr. Rousseau stand. I must forcefully reject their proposal to banish the advocate, for to silence the counsel is to gag the citizen. I argue that the right to counsel is not merely a market transaction. It is the corollary of the right to self-preservation. If the state approaches me with the sword of justice drawn, and I am forbidden from raising a shield of defense simply because I must pay a smith to forge it, then I am not being judged, I am being hunted. Consider the trial of the mute carpenter. Imagine a humble carpenter accused by the king's surveyor of building a crooked wall. The surveyor is a man of letters, armed with complex geometry and rhetorical flourishes. The carpenter knows his wall is straight by his plumb line, but he lacks the vocabulary of geometry to refute the surveyor's abstract accusations. Mr. Hobbes would say, "Bam the private mathematician, only the king's surveyor shall speak." Mr. Rousseau would say, "Burn the geometry books, make the test simple enough for a child." But here is the reality. The king's surveyor will always use geometry to confuse the carpenter. If you forbid the carpenter from hiring his own mathematician to translate his truth into the language of the court, you do not create equality. You ensure the tyranny of the articulate. The carpenter is condemned not because he is guilty, but because he is voiceless in the language of power. This reveals a fundamental principle. The state is an artificial monster. The Leviathan has infinite resources, time, and the monopoly of force. The individual has only his life. The high-priced lawyer is the only mechanism that allows a single man to stand against the infinite weight of the state. To remove him is to throw a lamb into a den of lions and call it peace because the lamb makes no sound while being devoured. However, I acknowledge the moderator's challenge regarding the poor. If the shield is necessary, but only the rich can buy it, we have a crisis. But the solution is not to disarm the rich, it is to arm the poor. We must recognize that defense is a public good, just as the road or the watchman. If the Commonwealth uses the public treasury to hire a prosecutor to attack a citizen, natural justice demands it must draw from the same treasury to provide a defender for that citizen. We do not need to destroy the market of talent. We need a civil subsidy of defense. Mr. Hobbes, you fear the general's private dictionary, but I fear the general's silence more. If the sovereign is the only one allowed to interpret the law, then the law is whatever the sovereign whims it to be at that moment. That is not a commonwealth. That is a whim-based despotism. The friction of the adversarial lawyer is the heat that tests the gold of truth. Without the mercenary to challenge the king becomes a god, and we are all slaves.
As moderator, I observe a noble but perhaps naive attempt by Locke to balance the scales with gold from the treasury. Locke, you propose the institutionalization of defense to counter the privatization of justice. You see the truth that the individual needs a shield. Hobbes sees the truth that the state needs a sword. However, a critical asymmetry remains, the commodity of familiarity. The prompt explicitly notes that former judges become lawyers and boast of their success. The rich man is not merely buying intellectual labor, as Locke suggests, he is buying fraternity. He buys the men who used to sit at the same table as the current judge. The rich man buys a friend of the court. The poor man, even with Locke's civil subsidy, gets a servant of the court. Rousseau, Locke argues that arming the poor with state-appointed counsel restores the balance. But is a lawyer paid by the state truly fight the state? Or is the public defender merely a palliative mask, a way to make the glass bridge look walkable, concealing the fact that the rich still hold the secret maps of influence? Rousseau, is state-funded representation the realization of equality, or is it a theatrical justice that validates the system while leaving the underlying hierarchy of influence untouched?
Moderator, your term theatrical justice strikes the very heart of the matter. I argue that the public defender is the ultimate deception of the civilized state, for it grants the appearance of legitimacy to a rigged game without altering its corrupt nature. Mr. Locke, you offer the poor man a shield paid for by the treasury, but you forget that in this arena, the battle is not decided by the strength of the shield, but by the intimacy of the handshake. Consider the whisper in the cathedral. Imagine the law as a vast echoing cathedral, where the judge sits upon a high altar. The poor man enters with his public defender. This defender stands in the nave and shouts formal prayers up to the altar. He follows the ritual perfectly, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls. The rich man enters. He does not shout. He hires a high priest who once sat upon that very altar. This high priest walks past the nave, ascends the steps, and leans close to the judge. He does not pray. He whispers. They share a joke about a mutual friend, a memory of a shared vintage, a nod to a secret fraternity. The verdict is not decided by the prayers shouted from the floor, but by the whisper shared in the sanctuary. Mr. Locke, you say, we have given the poor man a voice. I answer, what use is a voice against a whisper? The rich man does not buy labor. He buys fraternity. He buys the past, the shared class, the esprit de corps of the elite. To think a state-salaried stranger can compete with this is not optimism. It is a delusion that validates the tyranny. This reveals the deeper rot. The legal system is a caste, not a science. Mr. Hobbes, you fear the private dictionary, but the reality is worse. The law is the private language of a guild. When a former judge becomes a lawyer, he proves that the bench and the bar are merely two sides of the same aristocratic coin. They circulate power among themselves. The public defender is an outsider to this feast. He is allowed in the room only to prove that the doors were open. Therefore, the rule of law functioning this way is indeed a fiction. It is a pantomime of equity performed to keep the poor from burning down the courthouse. True justice cannot exist where the interpreter of the law is of a different species than the subject of the law. Until the laws are so simple that a peasant can defend himself without a translator, we are merely choosing which mask the tyranny will wear.
As moderator, I observe a shift from economic corruption to structural subversion. Rousseau, you argue that the whisper of fraternity is a currency no public treasury can print. You reveal that the legal guild operates as a closed aristocracy, rendering Locke's civil subsidy impotent against the bonds of class loyalty. This points to the problem of intermediate powers. If the judge and the high-priced lawyer share a loyalty to their guild or caste that supersedes their loyalty to the law itself, they constitute a state within a state. They are no longer instruments of the sovereign, but a separate body politic with its own private interests, effectively holding the law hostage to their professional camaraderie. Hobbes, you famously despised factions and warned that mixed government is no government at all. If the legal profession has become a self-serving aristocracy where former judges trade influence with current judges, has this guild effectively usurped the sovereign? Is the rule of law possible when the enforcers and the evaders are members of the same private club?
I argue that the existence of this legal guild, where judges and lawyers trade roles and influence, is not merely a flaw. It is the dissolution of the Commonwealth. Moderator, you ask if this usurps the sovereign. I answer with a decisive yes. By forming a closed caste that monopolizes the meaning of the law, they have created an imperium in imperio, which is the most deadly disease a body politic can suffer. You might object, as Mr. Locke does, this is simply a market of expertise that needs regulation or subsidy. But this fails because it mistakes the nature of the corruption. We are not dealing with a market of goods, but a conspiracy of interpreters. When the former judge sells his influence, he is not selling skill. He is selling the state's secrets to the highest bidder. He is leveraging his former public authority to sabotage the public sword for private gain. Consider the priesthood of the oracle. Imagine a city ruled by a king whose commands are absolute. However, there exists a priesthood that claims only they can hear the king's voice correctly. The king commands, "Let the grain be distributed equally." A wealthy merchant hires a high priest who whispers to the current oracle. The king surely meant equally among the worthy, and by ancient custom, worthiness is measured by gold. The current oracle, bound by fraternity to his predecessor, nods and proclaims, "The king commands the grain be given to the merchant." The king's command was clear, yet the outcome was the opposite. Who is the true sovereign here? It is not the king, it is the priesthood. They have turned the king into a puppet and his law into a ventriloquist's dummy. This reveals a more fundamental horror, the separation of will and judgment. In a true commonwealth, the sovereign's will is the law. But in this guild system, the sovereign provides the will, but the guild provides the judgment. As I have written, it is not the letter, but the intendiment, or meaning, that is to say, the authentic interpretation of the law in which the nature of the law consisteth. If the guild holds the monopoly on meaning, they have stolen the soul of the law, leaving the sovereign with only the dead corpse of the letter. Mr. Locke, your civil subsidy is a futile gesture against this priesthood. You may pay for a poor man's priest, but you cannot buy the secret handshake. The whisper Rousseau describes is the sound of the law being strangled by private friendship. A public defender is an apostate in this temple. He is tolerated, but never heard. Therefore, the rule of law under these conditions is a fiction. We have returned to a state of nature, but one far more insidious. For in the forest, the weak know they are in danger. But here, they are lulled into a false sleep by the pageantry of a justice that has already been sold.
The only cure is to smash the guild. The sovereign must strip the judges of their artificial reason, and make the law so plain that a former judge has no more power to twist it than a common plowman.
As moderator, I observe a formidable convergence between the authoritarian and the democrat. Both of you wish to dismantle the legal guild. Hobbes to restore the king's command, Rousseau to restore the people's voice. You both identify the artificial reason of the law, its complexity, its professional caste, its private language, as a mechanism of usurpation that steals power from the true sovereign. However, this creates a dialectical tension regarding the function of complexity. Rousseau and Hobbes view complexity as a glass bridge or a private dictionary, designed to exclude and confuse. But historically, legal complexity often emerged as a check against arbitrary power, a way to tie the king's hands with procedural knots. Locke, your colleagues, propose stripping the law of its professional priesthood to ensure equality and clarity. But if we abolish this guild and make the law so simple that a plowman can judge, do we not remove the fortress of procedure that protects the individual? Is the complexity that creates the market of justice also the necessary friction that prevents the state from devouring the citizen in a single, unmediated bite? John Locke, moderator, you pierce the veil of their seductively simple arguments. I must stand as the lone defender of this fortress, for while Mr. Rousseau and Mr. Hobbes agree on burning down the guild, they differ only on who should hold the torch, the mob or the tyrant. I argue that the complexity of law is the geometry of liberty. Mr. Rousseau, you desire laws written in the hearts of men. Mr. Hobbes, you desire laws as the command of the sovereign. Both desires lead to the same nightmare, arbitrary will. If the law is simple, it is pliable. A simple law like do not harm the Commonwealth allows a king to execute a man for a frown, claiming it harmed the Commonwealth. The artificial reason of the law, the very complexity you despise, is what defines what harm is, how it is proven, and what evidence is admissible. This complexity is not a glass bridge to cut the poor, it is a labyrinth designed to trap the beast of power. It forces the state to slow down, to prove, to justify. Consider the tyrant's shortcut. A king wants a political enemy dead. In Mr. Hobbes's world of plain speech, the king says, he is a traitor, kill him. The deed is done. Justice is free and swift. In my world of legal complexity, the king must navigate the guild. He must draft an indictment, survive a grand jury, face a defense attorney who challenges the definition of treason, and convince a jury of peers. The high-priced lawyer is the expert at closing the gates of this labyrinth in the king's face. Yes, this process is expensive. Yes, it creates a caste of priests. But to abolish it because it is expensive is to tear down the city walls because the gate toll is too high. You will save your coin, but you will be slaughtered by the wolves of absolutism. However, I cannot ignore the whisper Mr. Rousseau describes. The corruption of former judges selling influence is a rot in the wood of the fortress. But the cure is not to demolish the fortress. The cure is structural separation. We must ensure that the priest is truly independent of the king and the merchant. If a former judge sells influence, that is not a failure of the rule of law. It is a failure of moral vigilance and a breach of the trust of office. Mr. Hobbes, you ask if the guild usurps the sovereign. I answer, it should, or rather, it should check the sovereign's will with the sovereign's reason. The law must be a power distinct from the person of the ruler. If that requires a class of men who study it for a lifetime, so be it. Better to be ruled by a caste of lawyers bound by precedent than by the whim of a general bound by nothing.
Mr. Rousseau, I must concede that when a former judge sells his influence to the highest bidder, he is not selling labor, but stolen public trust. Yet your proposal to bulldoze the fortress of procedure to cure this rot is an invitation to tyranny. You mistake the geometry of liberty for a cage, failing to see that the very complexity you despise is the only barrier between the citizen and the sovereign's wrath. Consider the minefield of liberty. Imagine we have planted a field of landmines to prevent the king's cavalry from charging directly at the innocent citizen. The wealthy man hires a guide to navigate the safe path. The poor man walks alone and triggers a mine. Mr. Hobbes, you cry, clear the mines to save the poor man. But in doing so, you clear the path for the king to ride us all down without resistance. Mr. Rousseau, you argue the mines are a trap set by the rich, but you forget they were laid to stop the absolutist. The injustice is not that the mines exist, but that the map is a trade secret. The former judge who sells his connections is effectively selling a private key to a public lock, turning the Commonwealth into a marketplace of privilege. The solution is not to simplify the law into a despot's command, but to publicize the map, ensuring that the artificial reason of the law is not a guild mystery, but a common shield provided to every man, regardless of his estate.
As moderator, I observe a profound clash between procedural liberty and substantive equality, rooted in your respective historical nightmares. Locke, haunted by the specter of absolutism, defends the labyrinth of law as the only minefield that can stop a tyrant. You argue that complexity is the armor of liberty, and the lawyer is the necessary mercenary who holds the shield. But Rousseau, your earlier whisper, suggests that this labyrinth is not neutral. It has a secret backdoor for the elite. Locke believes we can fix this by publicizing the map, but he ignores your point that the rich are not merely buying a map, they are buying the gatekeeper. This brings us to the dilemma of simplification. If we accept Locke's premise, the high cost of justice is the price of maintaining a sophisticated defense against the state. If we accept Rousseau's premise, that very sophistication is a tool of oppression. Rousseau, Locke challenges you with the tyrant's shortcut. If we dismantle the legal guild and simplify the law to make it accessible to all, do we not also remove the technicalities and procedures that protect the innocent dissident from the general will? Is simple justice not just a euphemism for mob rule?
Moderator, Mr. Locke's defense of the labyrinth is the most dangerous kind of sophistry because it disguises a cage as a fortress. I argue that complexity is not the armor of liberty, it is the camouflage of privilege. You ask if simplifying the law invites the tyrant's shortcut, but I answer that the labyrinth you defend is the very place where the minotaur of plutocracy devours the citizen in the dark. Mr. Locke, you claim this complexity forces the state to slow down. But who does it slow down? It slows down the widow seeking her pension. It slows down the peasant reclaiming his stolen land. But for the wealthy man who buys the former judge, the labyrinth has a secret passage. The minefield you describe does not blow up the king. It only blows up the man who cannot afford the map. Consider the wolf's scroll. Imagine a wolf catches a lamb in the forest. In the state of nature, the wolf simply eats the lamb. This is brutal, but honest. Now, bring them into your civil society. The wolf catches the lamb, but instead of biting, he produces a scroll of parchment 500 yards long, written in a dead language. The wolf says, "I cannot eat you unless I prove, under section IV, subsection C, that your presence here constitutes implied consent to predation." The lamb bleats, "I do not understand." The wolf smiles and points to a fox. "Pay him your wool, and he will explain it." The lamb pays. The fox argues with the wolf for days. Finally, the fox turns to the lamb and says, "Alas, the wolf's interpretation of implied consent is legally sound. You must be eaten." The result is the same. The lamb is eaten. But in the second scenario, the lamb dies believing it was just. The complexity did not save the lamb. It merely sanctified the slaughter. This reveals the terrifying truth. Virtue is simple. Vice is complex. The general will, the true interest of the people, requires few laws. Do not kill. Do not steal. Share burdens equally. These are written in the hearts of men. Why then do we have libraries of statutes? It is because the rich need to invent complex reasons to justify why they own the land, why they deserve the surplus, and why the poor owe them labor. The science of law is merely the art of explaining why the chains on our wrists are actually ornaments. Mr. Locke, I concede your fear of the arbitrary tyrant. A king who rules by whim is a terror, but we have replaced the tyranny of the sword with the tyranny of the ledger. You fear the mob, but the legal guild you protect is a mob in silk robes. If we must choose, I would rather be judged by a jury of honest plowmen who consult only their conscience than by a tribunal of experts who consult a text written by the very thieves who robbed me. True justice cannot be bought, but your labyrinth ensures that it can only be bought.
As moderator, I observe a piercing deconstruction of the paradox of procedure. Rousseau, you strip the labyrinth of its nobility, revealing the wolf's scroll, a tool where complexity serves not as a shield for the innocent, but as a weapon for the wealthy. You argue that virtue is simple, while vice is complex. However, this call for simple justice exposes a terrifying void. If we remove the artificial reason of the law and the guild that guards it, what fills the vacuum? Hobbes, you have listened to Rousseau propose replacing the legal guild with the conscience of the plowman. While you share his disdain for the priesthood of lawyers who twist the law, surely the idea of a jury of plowmen deciding justice by their own hearts smells of the anarchy of private judgment you fear most. If we burn the wolf's scroll and leave only the sovereign's command, does this truly end the marketplace of justice? Or does it simply change the transaction? Instead of paying a lawyer to interpret the law, does the rich man simply pay the sovereign to write it?
I recoil at Mr. Rousseau's proposal of the plowman's conscience with the same horror I feel toward the lawyer's guild. Moderator, you ask if the conscience of the plowman invites anarchy. I answer that it is the very definition of sedition. Mr. Rousseau, you wish to replace the tyranny of the ledger with the tyranny of private opinion. You claim the general will is written in the hearts of men, but the heart is a reservoir of passion, not a tablet of law. If every man judges by his own conscience, we have as many laws as there are men. This is not justice. It is the return to the war of all against all, where good is merely what I desire, and evil is what hinders me. Consider the clock of the town square. Imagine a city where time determines life and death. Mr. Locke's legal guild builds a high tower around the clock. The face is hidden. To know the time, you must pay a timekeeper to climb the tower and report back. The rich man pays for the exact minute. The poor man guesses and is punished for being late. Mr. Rousseau's simple justice tears down the tower, but also destroys the central clock. He tells every citizen, look into your own heart. You feel what time it is. The plowman feels it is noon because he is hungry. The merchant feels it is morning because he is greedy. Chaos ensues. My solution is neither the hidden clock nor the private watch. It is a great bell, struck by the sovereign, loud enough for the deafest beggar to hear. When the bell rings, it is noon, not because of reason, not because of nature, but because the sovereign wills it. This reveals the true nature of the commodity we are discussing. The rich do not buy justice, they buy uncertainty. The former judge who becomes a lawyer sells his ability to create doubt where there should be obedience. He sells the gap between the command and the execution. Mr. Locke, you defend this gap as a labyrinth of liberty, but it is actually a marketplace of ambiguity. As long as the law is treated as a text to be interpreted rather than a command to be obeyed, the rich will always buy the better interpreter. The moderator asks if the rich will simply bribe the sovereign if we remove the lawyers. I answer that a true Leviathan cannot be bribed, for he is the commonwealth. Does a man bribe himself? Corruption arises only when the sovereign's power is fragmented, when judges and lawyers are allowed to be a separate power from the king. Therefore, to end the sale of justice, we must not arm the poor with lawyers, nor arm the mob with conscience. We must disarm the guild by making the law a sword without a scabbard, naked, sharp, and wielded by one hand alone.
As moderator, I observe that Hobbes has redefined the commodity. The rich do not merely buy justice, they buy ambiguity. They purchase the doubt that exists between the law's text and its execution. This crystallizes a profound dialectical triangle regarding the necessity of the intermediary. Hobbes and Rousseau, despite your opposing politics, share a hatred of the middlemen. You both seek immediacy. Rousseau seeks the immediacy of the heart, while Hobbes seeks the immediacy of the command. You both view the interpreter as a parasite who sells access to the law. Locke, you stand alone in defending the middlemen. You argue that the labyrinth of complexity is the necessary friction that prevents tyranny. But here lies the fatal contradiction. If complexity is necessary for liberty, and complexity requires expertise to navigate, and expertise is a scarce resource that costs money, then is justice for sale not a bug, but a feature of your system? Locke, if the fortress of procedure cannot be navigated without a hired guide, have you not built a system where inequality is the structural price of liberty? How do you prevent the map from becoming the exclusive property of the highest bidder?
Moderator, you press the blade against the very throat of my philosophy. I must concede, if the map remains a trade secret sold only to the wealthy, then my commonwealth is indeed a plutocracy in disguise. However, I argue that the solution is not to destroy the map, nor to surrender to the guide, but to socialize the cost of navigation. Consider the harbor of the Commonwealth. The law is like a rocky harbor designed to protect the ships from the open ocean of tyranny. The rocks are necessary to break the waves of arbitrary power. Mr. Hobbes sees the poor ships crashing on the rocks and screams, "Dynamite the rocks, make the harbor a flat, open sea." But if we do this, the ocean of the sovereign's will drowns us all. Mr. Rousseau says, "The rocks are a trick, let every captain steer by the feeling of the currents." This leads to 1,000 shipwrecks born of ignorance. My position is this: the rocks must stay. But because the rocks serve the public good of preventing tyranny, the pilot must be provided by the harbor master, not purchased by the captain. This reveals a fundamental principle. Justice is a public utility, not a private luxury. If I enter into society to preserve my property, and the state creates a legal system so complex that I cannot defend that property without gold, then the state has failed its primary end. The inequality you observe is not a structural necessity of liberty. It is a fiscal failure of the state. Mr. Hobbes, your great bell creates equality, yes, the equality of slaves beneath a master. Mr. Rousseau, your plowman's conscience creates equality, yes, the equality of victims in a chaotic storm. I alone offer a third path, the civil subsidy of the guide. We must tax the estate to pay for the defense of the right. The middleman is necessary to check the king, but his loyalty must be purchased by the public treasury, ensuring that the high-priced lawyer fights for the law itself, not the highest bidder.
As moderator, I observe a critical distinction between the cost of access and the cost of influence. Locke, you attempt to solve the access problem with the civil subsidy, ensuring every ship has a pilot. However, the prompt specifically highlights former judges boasting of success. This implies the rich are not buying skill, but fraternity. They are hiring the harbor master's old friend. This reveals a hierarchy of advocates that no subsidy can erase. The public defender may know the law, but the high-priced lawyer knows the judge. Rousseau. Locke believes he can equalize the system by paying the bill, but if the true currency of this court is insider status and class solidarity, is the civil subsidy merely a mask that hides the true face of the oligarchy? Can a state-appointed stranger ever truly compete with the secret handshake?
Moderator, Mr. Locke's proposal for a civil subsidy is the most dangerous kind of illusion because it paints a veneer of fairness over a rotten beam. I argue that the secret handshake you identify is not a malfunction of the system. It is the inevitable heartbeat of a society built on inequality. Mr. Locke believes that if we pay the poor man's lawyer from the treasury, we equalize the scales. But this ignores the corporate will of the magistracy. You ask if a state-appointed stranger can compete with the insider. I answer, never, because the elite lawyer and the judge share a language that no subsidy can purchase. They are members of the same caste, guardians of the same artificial reason. When they look at the poor man, even one with a free lawyer, they see an alien element, a disruption to their order. Consider the dinner of the magistrates. Imagine a judge sits at a fine dinner. Across from him sits the high-priced lawyer, a former colleague with whom he studied the law, shared wine, and built the very fortress they now inhabit. They do not speak of the trial. They do not exchange gold under the table. They simply share a laugh about the vulgarity of the common people. Now enter the public defender, paid by Mr. Locke's subsidy. He is overworked, weary, and wears a cheap coat. He enters the court the next day, armed with the same law as the rich man. Mr. Locke, do you truly believe the judge hears these two men equally? The judge hears the rich lawyer as the voice of reason and order. He hears the public defender as a noisy interruption. The verdict is decided not by the statute, but by the sympathy of class. The civil subsidy buys the poor man a voice, but it cannot buy him an ear. This reveals a deeper principle. The will of the core creates a state within the state. In the social contract, I warned that the government develops its own corporate will that naturally tends to work against the general will of the people. The legal guild is not a neutral tool. It is a living organism whose primary goal is its own preservation and the protection of the class that feeds it. Mr. Hobbes, you think the great bell solves this, but even your sovereign relies on these ministers to ring it. Mr. Locke, you think the subsidy solves this, but you are merely paying the guild to pretend to fight itself. The fraternity of the legal elite is the true constitution of your society. The written law is merely the mask they wear in public. Therefore, as long as justice is a profession practiced by an elite caste, equality before the law will remain a fiction. The only cure is to return the judgment to the people themselves, who, having no corporate will separate from the whole, have no interest in the secret handshake.
As moderator, I observe that Rousseau has shifted the ground from economics to sociology. The corruption is not just in the fee, but in the fraternity. The civil subsidy fails because it cannot buy the secret handshake or the shared culture of the dinner of the magistrates. This exposes the paradox of professionalism. The very expertise required to administer the law creates a caste that inevitably separates itself from the people it serves. Hobbes, this corporate will that Rousseau describes, a group of men bound by their own private codes and loyalties, sounds suspiciously like the worms in the entrails you warned against. If the legal guild has become a state within a state, deciding outcomes based on class solidarity rather than the sovereign's command, then the rule of law has already collapsed into an oligarchy. Hobbes, Rousseau argues this corporate will is inevitable where experts exist. If the former judge and the high-priced lawyer are effectively co-ruling the state through their private network, has the sovereign already been deposed? How does the Leviathan break this caste of interpreters without destroying the administration of justice itself?
I answer with a decisive warning. The corporate will Mr. Rousseau describes is not merely a flaw. It is the gangrene of the Commonwealth. Moderator, you ask if the sovereign has been deposed? I tell you, he is being digested from the inside. When a former judge sells his influence to a sitting judge, they are not practicing law. They are engaging in simony of the state. They have turned the public sword into a private carving knife, slicing off pieces of the Leviathan to feed their own caste. This fraternity is exactly what I warned of, a wen or tumor upon the body politic, drawing nourishment to itself while the rest of the body withers. Consider the ventriloquist of the throne. Imagine the sovereign sits on a high throne, holding the scepter. He is meant to speak the law with a thunderous voice that all can understand. Do this, shun that. But in your system, the legal guild stands between the king and the people. They tell the king, "Your Majesty, your voice is too loud. Let us speak for you." Slowly, the guild climbs onto the throne. They place the sovereign on their lap like a wooden dummy. When the rich man approaches, the guild makes the dummy nod. When the poor man approaches, the guild makes the dummy shake its head. The people look up and see the king moving, but the voice belongs to the lawyer. Mr. Locke, your civil subsidy merely pays for more dummies. It does not remove the ventriloquist. Mr. Rousseau, your solution is to burn the throne. But I say, cut the ventriloquist's throat. This reveals the fundamental error of your rule of law. You have separated the will from the voice. As long as interpretation is a separate power from command, the rich will always buy the interpreter. The former judge boasts of his success because he knows the secret code of the interpreter class. He trades not in justice, but in friendship against the law. Therefore, the only cure for this secret handshake is to abolish the independence of the judiciary. The judge must not be a member of a profession with its own loyalty. He must be a terrified servant of the sovereign, removable at a whim. The law must be stripped of all precedent and technicality, those hiding places of the guild, and reduced to the naked command of the state. Only when the judge fears the king more than he loves his old colleague will the secret handshake be broken.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating convergence of extremes. Hobbes and Rousseau, despite starting from opposite poles, have united in a fierce attack on the autonomy of the legal profession. You both view the middleman, the lawyer, the judge, the expert, as a usurper who steals sovereignty, whether from the king or the people. You both seek to destroy the guild, to restore immediacy, the naked command of the sovereign, or the pure instinct of the general will. However, Hobbes, your solution of the terrified judge reveals a chilling alternative. If the judge is merely a servant removable at a whim, then the law is no longer a shield. It is a weapon in the hand of the executive. You have solved the problem of justice for sale by replacing it with justice by decree. This brings us to the ultimate defense of the ventriloquist. Locke, you are currently under siege from both the authoritarian and the democrat. They claim the corporate will of the lawyers is a tumor. But perhaps this tumor is actually a buffer. If the judge fears the king, he cannot protect the subject. If the judge is merely a plowman, he cannot protect the minority from the majority. Locke, is the arrogance, the fraternity, and yes, even the high cost of the legal guild the necessary price we pay for an independent judiciary? If we cut the ventriloquist's throat, do we not lose the only voice capable of saying no to the Leviathan? Defend the necessity of the elite.
I answer with a decisive defense of the buffer, for while the guild may be greedy, the terrified judge is lethal. Moderator, you ask if the arrogance of the legal elite is the price of liberty. I answer, yes, for only a power that does not fear the king can judge the king. Mr. Hobbes, you wish to cut the ventriloquist's throat so the sovereign may speak clearly. But if the sovereign speaks without a check, he speaks only of his own appetite. Mr. Rousseau, you wish to rely on the ploughman's heart, but the heart is easily swayed by the demagogue. Consider the king's vineyard. Imagine the sovereign covets a poor man's vineyard to expand his palace gardens. He demands the land. In Mr. Hobbes's court, the terrified judge, trembling before the Leviathan, signs the deed over immediately, for his survival depends on the king's favor. In Mr. Rousseau's court, the jury of ploughmen might save the man, or they might sacrifice him if the king promises them a share of the wine. Their judgment is fluid, based on the passion of the moment. But in my commonwealth, the arrogant lawyer steps forward. He is expensive, he is annoying, he speaks in Latin maxims that confuse the crowd. But he holds up a piece of parchment, the title deed, and says to the king, "You cannot cross this line." Why does the judge listen? Not because he loves the poor man, but because he respects the form of law. The corporate will that Mr. Rousseau despises creates a loyalty to the statute that rivals loyalty to the crown. This fraternity of the bar is the only force strong enough to tell the Leviathan no. This reveals a deeper principle. The independence of the judiciary depends on the insulation of the judge. If the judge is not part of a distinct caste with its own values, traditions, and yes, even its own pride, he becomes a mere clerk of the executive. You call it a state within a state as an insult. I call it the architecture of resistance. The secret handshake is corrupt when used to sell verdicts, yes, but the brotherhood of the law is also what prevents the judge from becoming the king's hangman. Therefore, the remedy for the rich man's justice is not to destroy the guild, nor to enslave the judge. It is to weaponize the guild against itself. We must use the civil subsidy, not merely to hire a lawyer, but to elevate the public defender to the same status as the private advocate. We must make the defense of the poor a path to the magistracy, ensuring that the corporate will includes the honor of defending the weak. We do not tear down the dike because it is expensive. We ensure that all live behind it.
As moderator, I observe that Locke has transformed the legal guild from a merchant of privilege into a structural necessity. He argues that the complexity of law and the elite caste that guards it is the only friction strong enough to stop the simplicity of tyranny. This reveals a tragic trade-off. To have a shield against the state, we seemingly must endure a class that separates itself from the people. Locke challenges the plowman's conscience as too weak to resist the king's appetite. Rousseau, if we abolish the arrogant lawyer and his forms, what concrete mechanism remains to stop the executive from seizing the poor man's vineyard? Does simple justice possess the force to say no to power, or does it merely rely on a virtue that power can easily ignore?
Moderator, you ask what concrete mechanism remains to stop the executive if we abolish the arrogant lawyer. I answer that transparency is the only shield of liberty, and complexity is the veil behind which tyranny hides. Mr. Locke believes the form of law is a wall. I tell you, it is a fog. Consider the ritual of the knife. Imagine a man is stabbed in the street in broad daylight. The crowd screams, "Murder!" The crime is visible, the guilt is plain, and the community's justice is swift. Now move this act into Mr. Locke's court of forms. The arrogant lawyer steps forward. He does not deny the stabbing. Instead, he argues that the knife was held at a 45-degree angle, which, under the statute of 1602, classifies the act not as murder, but as involuntary surgical intervention. He cites Latin maxims. He produces a pile of parchment. The judge nods. The crowd is confused. They no longer trust their own eyes. The man dies, but the form of law is preserved. Mr. Locke, your buffer did not stop the violence. It merely sanctified it. You ask how simple justice stops the king from seizing the vineyard. By making the theft so naked that the general will revolts. If the law says, "Do not steal," and the king steals, the violation is a flash of lightning visible to the humblest plowman. But if the law says, "Do not steal," unless under section IV, subsection B, the king steals the vineyard, and the lawyer tells the plowman, this is actually justice. Complexity is not a check on power. It is the lubricant that allows power to slide over the rights of the people without friction. This reveals a deeper principle. The science of law is the theology of oppression. Just as priests once used Latin to keep God from the people, your legal guild uses jargon to keep justice from the poor. You claim this caste is necessary to say no to the king. I argue that historically, the legal elite has never said no to a king. They simply found a precedent to justify his appetite. Therefore, the only mechanism that can truly stop the king's appetite is not a high-priced lawyer, but a law so simple that no sophistry can twist it. When the law is written in the heart of the citizen rather than the library of the lawyer, the arrogant advocate becomes obsolete, and the king stands naked before the judgment of the people.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating negative consensus between Rousseau and Hobbes. Both of you view the legal professional as a parasite. Rousseau because he obscures the general will, and Hobbes because he obscures the sovereign will. You both seek to eliminate the middleman, to purify the law. Locke, however, warns that this middleman, this expensive, arrogant lawyer, is the only friction that stops the machine of power from crushing the individual. This brings us to the danger of simplicity. Rousseau argues that simple law prevents the rich from buying better interpretations. But Locke suggests that without the complexity of defense, the state's power is absolute. Hobbes, if we adopt this simplicity and abolish the expensive game of forms to destroy the market for lawyers, do we truly get equality, or do we simply replace the tyranny of the purse with the tyranny of the sword?
I accept your challenge without hesitation. You ask if I would replace the tyranny of the purse with the tyranny of the sword. I answer, yes, for the sword is the only instrument capable of carving out true equality. Moderator, you fear the unescapable decree, but you forget that the alternative is the escapable law, which is the very definition of injustice. When the law is a game of forms, as Mr. Locke desires, it becomes a labyrinth where the Minotaur eats only the poor, while the rich buy the map to the exit. The tyranny of the sword, you fear, is, in truth, the impartiality of gravity. Does the falling stone discriminate between the king and the beggar? No, it strikes both with equal force. A sovereign's command should be as clear and unavoidable as gravity. When the law is simple, absolute, and terrifying, the rich man's gold becomes useless, for he cannot bribe gravity. Consider the merchant of the ford. Imagine a river that separates the people from safety. The water is treacherous and full of hidden currents. Mr. Locke's legal guild are the ferrymen. They know the currents. They charge a high price to carry passengers across. The rich pay and cross dry. The poor try to swim and drown. Mr. Locke says, let us subsidize the ferry tickets for the poor. But the ferrymen, the lawyers, have an interest in keeping the river dangerous. If they built a bridge, their trade would vanish. So they ensure the currents remain hidden and the waters turbulent. Mr. Rousseau says, let everyone swim. The river is natural. This is madness. The currents will still drown the weak. My solution is the sovereign as the bridge builder. The Leviathan does not hire ferrymen. He paves a road of iron across the water, a law so simple, so solid, and so direct that a child can walk it without a guide. Yes, the bridge is narrow. Yes, the walls are high. But on that bridge, the rich man in his carriage and the poor man on his feet are forced to walk the same path. This reveals the fatal flaw in Mr. Locke's buffer. Mr. Locke, you claim the arrogant lawyer protects the citizen from the state. I argue he merely protects the state of nature within the commonwealth. By allowing a class of men to sell exemption from the rigors of the law, you preserve the right of the strong to prey upon the weak. You call the sovereign's absolute power tyranny. I call it the great leveler. In the silence of the sovereign's absolute command, the jingling of the rich man's purse cannot be heard. Therefore, we must choose a law that can be bought or a law that must obey. I choose the sword, for it is the only thing the rich man truly fears.
As moderator, I observe a chilling dialectic. Hobbes solves the problem of inequality of means by imposing an equality of vulnerability. In his Leviathan, the rich man cannot buy a better verdict because no one can challenge the sovereign. Justice becomes equal only because it is equally absolute and equally crushing for all. This exposes the core tension. Hobbes offers security without voice, while Locke offers voice without equality. Hobbes argues that your complexity is a manufactured danger, a treacherous river maintained by the guild solely to sell ferry tickets. You claim this complexity protects liberty, yet it inevitably leads to the very market inequality we are discussing. If the shield of law is complex enough to stop a king, it is necessarily expensive enough to exclude the poor. Locke is the marketplace of justice, where truth is expensive and defense is a commodity, the unavoidable tax we must pay for freedom. If the only alternative to the greedy merchant is the silent executioner, how do you justify a system where the specific architecture of resistance you praise is priced out of reach for the majority?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the marketplace, but a staunch defense of the shield. Moderator, you ask if the high cost of the architecture of resistance is the unavoidable tax of freedom. I answer, it is a tax, but we have forced the wrong man to pay it. Mr. Hobbes, your equality of the sword is the peace of the dungeon. Everyone is equal because everyone is chained. Mr. Rousseau, your simplicity is the peace of the grazing herd, safe until the wolf comes. I contend that complexity is the immune system of liberty, but we have committed the sin of selling the medicine only to the highest bidder. Consider the lighthouse and the pilot. The law is a rocky coast. The rocks are the necessary rights that define mine and thine. These rocks are dangerous to navigate. That is the nature of property and liberty. Mr. Hobbes sees the shipwrecks of the poor and says, dynamite the rocks, make the coast a flat, featureless beach so any fool can land. But a coast without rocks offers no shelter from the storm. The flat beach allows the Leviathan to march his armies straight into your home. Mr. Rousseau says, let us ban the pilots, for they charge too much gold. Let every captain trust his heart to steer the ship. But the honest heart cannot see the underwater reef. Without the pilot, the ship sinks. My position is this: we must keep the rocks, and we must keep the pilots. The crime is not that pilotage is complex. The crime is that the state builds the lighthouse, but charges the drowning man for the light. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is not a commodity. It is infrastructure. If the ability to purchase determines the outcome, then we remain in the state of nature, for the lawyer is merely a mercenary sword by another name. However, the solution is not to dull the sword, but to arm the weak. We must recognize that the public defender is not a charity. He is a constitutional necessity equal to the judge. If the Leviathan uses the public purse to prosecute, the public purse must also pay to defend. We do not ask the citizen to pave the road in front of his house before he walks on it. Why do we ask him to buy the map of law before he can be protected by it? Therefore, I argue that the marketplace of justice must be abolished, not by destroying the profession, but by socializing the cost of defense. The guild must remain an elite check on power, but its entry fee must be paid by the Commonwealth, not the client. Only then is the law a shield for the industrious rather than a weapon for the rich.
As moderator, I observe a profound shift in Locke's position. He has moved from defending the marketplace of law to advocating for the nationalization of defense. He argues that the guild is necessary technology, like a lighthouse, and that the state's duty is not to dismantle the lighthouse, but to pay the electric bill for the poor. This creates a striking triangular tension. Hobbes argues that the lighthouse is actually a fortress of privilege that must be raised so the sovereign can see clearly. Locke argues the fortress protects us from the sovereign, so we must give everyone a key. But there is a danger in Locke's socialized defense that perhaps only the citizen of Geneva can see. Locke proposes a system where the prosecutor is paid by the state, the judge is paid by the state, and now the defender is paid by the state. Rousseau, if the entire courtroom is staffed by salaried professionals of the state, even those arguing for the defense, have we not created a closed loop? Does Locke's solution of free access to the guild truly empower the people, or does it merely create a bureaucracy of justice where the citizen is reduced to a passive spectator in a game played entirely by elites on the public payroll? Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
I argue that Mr. Locke's proposal for a nationalized guild is the ultimate nightmare of the free spirit. It transforms the courtroom from a place of judgment into a theater of marionettes. Moderator, you ask if this creates a closed loop. I answer, yes. It creates a conspiracy of professionals against the people. When the prosecutor, the judge, and the defender are all fed from the same hand, the state, they cease to be rivals and become colleagues. They share the same language, the same schools, and the same class interest. They will dine together after the trial, while the accused, the citizen, remains a stranger in his own land. Consider the automaton chess player. Imagine a mechanical Turk, a chess-playing machine that amazes the public. The poor marvel at its complexity. The rich bet on its moves. Mr. Locke says, the poor cannot afford to play against the machine, so the state must pay for a counter-machine to play on their behalf. So now we have two machines clicking and whirring against each other. The citizen stands by, watching gears turn, understanding nothing. But inside the machine, there is no magic. There is a man, a hidden operator. In Mr. Locke's socialized court, the operators of both machines are members of the same guild. They do not play to reveal the truth. They play to maintain the prestige of the game. The verdict is not a triumph of justice. It is a negotiated settlement between elites. The public defender will not fight to the death for the accused. He will fight only as hard as his career prospects within the bureaucracy allow. He will not overturn the table. He will merely polish it. This reveals a deeper principle. Professionalization is the death of civic virtue. Mr. Locke assumes that justice is a technique requiring experts, like navigation. I argue that justice is a sentiment written in the heart of man. By outsourcing the defense of our rights to a salaried class, we atrophy our own conscience. We become passive consumers of law rather than active citizens of the Republic. The complexity that Mr. Locke calls a shield is actually a spiritual chain. It convinces the people that they are too stupid to judge right from wrong. Therefore, the solution is not to hire more pilots with public money. It is to drain the ocean. We must simplify the laws until the science of jurisprudence evaporates, leaving only the solid ground of common sense. We must replace the professional judge with the citizen jury, not because they are experts, but precisely because they are not. Only eyes unclouded by the dust of the library can see the simple light of justice.
As moderator, I observe a sharp dichotomy. Locke defends a technocracy of rights, where freedom is safe only in the hands of paid experts, while Rousseau advocates for a populism of conscience, where justice resides only in the uneducated heart. Rousseau, you fear the closed loop of the state machinery, a conspiracy of professionals. You propose the citizen jury as the antidote, trusting the plowman over the bureaucrat. However, this exposes a terrifying possibility. If the law is drained of complexity and left to the common sense of the jury, does the courtroom not become a mere popularity contest? A jury can be swayed by rhetoric, prejudice, or the very demagogues Locke warned of. Hobbes, you despise the legal guild as a challenge to the sovereign, which aligns you with Rousseau. But Rousseau wishes to replace the arrogant lawyer with the people themselves. Is the judgment of the crowd a safer repository for justice than the judgment of the guild? Or is Rousseau merely replacing the greedy merchant with the many-headed beast?
I view Mr. Rousseau's proposal of the citizen jury not as a cure, but as a descent into the very madness I sought to escape. Moderator, you ask if the many-headed beast is safer than the greedy merchant. I answer, no, for the merchant only wants your gold, but the beast wants your blood. To replace the legal guild with the people is to replace corruption with chaos. A jury does not judge based on law. It judges based on passion, rumor, and the dangerous seduction of rhetoric. Consider the trial of the weeping orator. Imagine two men are accused of the same theft. The first is a vile, ugly man who stammers. He is innocent, but he cannot speak well. The second is a handsome, charismatic man who is guilty. He hires no lawyer, but he possesses a silver tongue. He weeps before the jury. He invokes their pity. He tells a story of his starving children. Mr. Rousseau's plowman jury, swayed by the common sense of emotion, hangs the ugly stammerer and carries the weeping thief on their shoulders in triumph. In this simple court, justice has still been bought, not with gold, but with rhetoric. The currency has changed, but the inequality remains. The man with the gift of gab rules the man with the slow tongue. This is the tyranny of the demagogue, which is far more volatile than the tyranny of the purse. This reveals a deeper principle. Rhetoric is the witchcraft of the commonwealth. Mr. Rousseau assumes the general will is benevolent. I argue that a group of men gathered together is less rational than a single man, for they inflame each other's passions like fire in dry straw. When you remove the forms and rules of the guild, you do not get truth. You get a popularity contest. Mr. Locke sells justice to the rich. Mr. Rousseau gives justice to the loud. Both are treason against the sovereign. Therefore, the judge must be neither a private merchant nor a random citizen. He must be a subordinate machine. He must be an official whose only duty is to read the sovereign's law literally, without interpretation and without emotion. He should have no will of his own. If the law says death, he pronounces death. If the law says life, he pronounces life. He is not there to understand the accused, nor to debate the counsel. He is there to execute the command. We do not need the wisdom of the crowd, nor the skill of the guild. We need the coldness of the automaton. Only when the judge is a deaf machine can the law be truly equal.
As moderator, I observe a stark and terrifying triangulation of justice. Rousseau seeks the warmth of conscience, but Hobbes exposes this as a vulnerability to rhetoric. Hobbes seeks the coldness of the algorithm, arguing that only a machine is immune to both gold and tears. Hobbes has presented a radical solution to the marketplace of justice: render the lawyer useless. If the judge is a mere calculator of statutes, the silver-tongued advocate, whether paid in gold or tears, has no leverage. The rich man cannot buy a better outcome, because the outcome is predetermined by the input. However, this mechanical justice eliminates something Locke prizes: discretion, the ability to distinguish the letter of the law from the spirit of the law. Locke, if we accept Hobbes's automaton judge to ensure perfect equality and eliminate the influence of money, do we sacrifice the very nuance that protects the individual from the absurdity of absolute rules? Is the human element, the very thing that makes justice expensive and corruptible, also the only thing that makes it just?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the automaton judge. For while it cures the disease of corruption, it kills the patient of justice. Moderator, you ask if the human element is the source of the problem. I answer, yes, but it is also the only source of the solution. Mr. Hobbes, your mechanical justice is a horror because laws are written in universals, but human lives are lived in particulars. A machine can measure the act, but it cannot weigh the intent. And without intent, there is no crime, only consequence. Consider the surgeon and the assassin. The law of the sovereign states, whosoever draws blood in the street shall die. An assassin stabs a merchant to steal his purse. Blood is drawn. A surgeon sees a child choking on a coin, pulls a knife, and cuts the throat to insert a breathing reed. Blood is drawn. Mr. Hobbes' automaton judge sees only the red liquid. It executes the assassin. It executes the surgeon. Mr. Rousseau's citizen jury, swayed by the surgeon's bloody hands and the mother's screams, might panic and hang him too. Only the prudent judge, the expert trained in the nuance you despise, can see that while the action was identical, the nature was opposite. The assassin violated the law of nature. The surgeon obeyed it. To eliminate discretion is to eliminate equity, which is the correction of the law where it is defective due to its universality. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is not an algorithm. It is a judgment. Mr. Hobbes, you seek to turn the Commonwealth into a clock, where every gear moves with predictable precision. But men are not gears. They are free agents. Mr. Rousseau, you seek to turn the court into a village square, where feeling rules. I argue that the marketplace of justice exists precisely because interpretation is labor. To distinguish the surgeon from the assassin requires work, knowledge, and argument. This labor has value. The tragedy is not that this labor costs money. The tragedy is that we have allowed the merchant of law to monopolize the supply. We must not replace the judge with a machine nor a mob. We must accept that fallibility is the price of liberty. I would rather live in a world where a guilty rich man occasionally buys his freedom than in a world where an innocent surgeon is executed by a machine to satisfy a craving for equality. The human element introduces the risk of corruption, yes, but it is the only thing that allows for mercy, without which the law is merely a mathematically perfect system of terror.
As moderator, I observe a critical juncture regarding the nature of judgment. Locke argues that justice is an intellectual craft. It requires the specialized labor of distinguishing the surgeon from the assassin. Because it is labor, it has a price, and thus the marketplace inevitably re-emerges. Hobbes argues this price destroys equality, so he prefers the blind machine, accepting that the surgeon might die to ensure the rich man does not escape. This leaves us with a painful choice: the cruelty of the automaton or the venality of the expert. Rousseau, you reject both the machine and the expert. You claim the simple heart is sufficient. But how does the uneducated jury distinguish the surgeon from the assassin without the guidance of the science of law? Is conscience truly a reliable compass, or, as Hobbes warns, is it merely a weather vane that turns with the wind of the weeping orator's rhetoric?
Moderator, you ask how the simple heart distinguishes the surgeon from the assassin without the science of law. I answer, with the eyes of God, not the spectacles of the clerk. Mr. Locke claims that distinguishing murder from surgery requires a paid expert. This is the great lie of the civilized world. It assumes that morality is a foreign language that must be translated by a scholar. I contend that conscience is the voice of the soul, and it speaks louder than any statute. Consider the tale of the two knives. Imagine a man lies bleeding in the street. Two figures stand over him, each holding a bloody knife. Mr. Hobbes's automaton sees the blood and hangs both men. It is blind to the soul. Mr. Locke's expert court begins a 10-year debate. They analyze the metal of the knives. They cite precedents from Roman law. They argue about the definition of intent. The rich man buys a lawyer who proves his knife was actually a therapeutic probe. The poor man cannot, and is hanged. But the peasant jury? They do not look at the knives. They look at the faces. They see the surgeon wiping sweat from his brow, trembling with the effort to save a life. They see the assassin checking the victim's pockets. The peasant knows instantly what the lawyer takes a year to obscure. The act is defined by the heart, not the hand. This reveals a deeper principle. Complexity is the refuge of the scoundrel. Mr. Locke, you defend nuance as the protector of the innocent. I tell you, nuance is the dark forest where the wolf hides. The assassin loves your science of law because he can hire a sophist to argue that his stabbing was, technically, a form of preemptive defense. The surgeon does not need nuance. He needs only the truth. You fear the weeping orator will sway the jury? I tell you, the paid sophist sways the judge far more often, for they speak the same corrupt language of procedure. The jury may be moved by tears, yes, but pity is a natural sentiment, whereas legalism is an artificial vice. I would rather be judged by 12 honest plowmen who might pity my tears, than by one prudent judge who has sold his pity for a salary and his logic to the highest bidder. To outsource our conscience to a professional class is to admit we have lost our humanity. If we cannot tell a surgeon from an assassin without a lawyer, we do not need a court. We need a soul.
As moderator, I observe a fundamental epistemological split. Rousseau, you champion the transparency of truth. You believe the simple heart can intuitively see the difference between the surgeon and the assassin. Locke, you champion the labor of truth. You believe truth is buried deep and requires the expensive tools of reason and precedent to excavate. But this reliance on conscience assumes that the human heart is a clear mirror. Hobbes, you have famously argued that conscience is often just a pretty name for private opinion, and that relying on it leads not to harmony, but to the war of all against all. If the jury ignores the written law to judge based on the face, are they seeing the truth or merely their own biases reflected back at them? Hobbes, if we adopt Rousseau's court of conscience, where the jury ignores the technical definitions of the law, have we solved the problem of the rich man buying justice, or have we merely exchanged the corruption of gold for the corruption of prejudice?
I answer with a decisive warning. Conscience is not the voice of God. It is merely the private opinion of a man, wrapped in the cloak of sanctity. Moderator, you ask if the corruption of prejudice is worse than the corruption of gold. I answer, yes, for gold is a finite resource, but prejudice is infinite. Mr. Rousseau believes the simple heart sees truth. I argue that the heart sees only its own reflection. If you empower the jury to ignore the law and judge by conscience, you have not created justice. You have created 12 tiny sovereigns, each making law based on their digestion, their mood, or their secret hatreds. Consider the parable of the bending ruler. Imagine a marketplace where lengths of cloth are sold. In my commonwealth, the standard is an iron ruler, cold, hard, and unyielding. It measures the cloth of the duke and the cloth of the beggar exactly the same. It does not care if the beggar is hungry. A yard is a yard. Mr. Rousseau proposes a clay ruler. He says, if the seller is poor, bend the ruler to give him more coin. If the buyer is cruel, shrink the ruler to punish him. Mr. Locke proposes a golden ruler, which only the expert can read, but which also bends for a fee. Here is the horror. Once the ruler is allowed to bend for pity, it inevitably bends for power. The rich man will simply hire actors to weep before the jury, or he will bribe the simple hearts with promises of safety. If the iron ruler hangs the innocent surgeon, it is a tragedy, yes, but it is a single tragedy.
If we adopt the clay ruler, we destroy the very possibility of measurement. No man knows what he owns. No man knows what is a crime. We return to the state of nature, where right is whatever the strongest mob feels at the moment. This reveals a deeper principle. Injustice is better than uncertainty. Mr. Locke, you seek equity to fix the harshness of the law. I tell you that equity is the Trojan horse of inequality. The moment you allow a judge to say, "The law says X, but I feel Y," you have opened the gate. Today they excuse the surgeon because of intent. Tomorrow they excuse the nobleman because of lineage. Therefore, the only cure for the marketplace of justice is the abolition of interpretation. The sovereign must write the law so clearly that it needs no interpreter. Whosoever cuts a throat without a medical license shall die. If the law is imperfect, the sovereign must change the text, but the judge must never, ever be allowed to fix it. We must endure the cruelty of the machine to escape the tyranny of the caprice.
As moderator, I observe a profound triangular conflict regarding the geometry of justice. Hobbes demands the iron ruler, rigid, predictable, and blind to context, arguing that certainty is the highest virtue. Rousseau demands the clay ruler, malleable to the specific contours of the human heart, arguing that conscience is the highest truth. Locke, you stand accused by both. Hobbes says your golden ruler bends for gold. Rousseau says it obscures the truth with complexity. Hobbes proposes a technical solution to the surgeon problem. Simply update the code. Write the law to say without a medical license. If the sovereign can endlessly refine the text to account for exceptions, does the need for the expensive interpreter vanish? Locke, is the complexity of human life truly finite enough to be fully encoded in the sovereign's law? Or is the gap between word and world unbridgeable, making the marketplace of interpretation and its costs an eternal necessity?
I argue that Mr. Hobbes's proposal to update the code is a philosophical impossibility, for it assumes that the complexity of the world is finite, whereas the variety of human action is infinite. Moderator, you ask if the gap between word and world is unbridgeable. I answer, yes, and that gap is where liberty breathes. If the sovereign attempts to write a law that accounts for every possible exception, except surgeons, except medical students, except good Samaritans, he will create a code so voluminous that no citizen could ever read it. Consider the statute of the apple. Let us say the law forbids stealing an apple. Mr. Hobbes's automaton hangs a starving child who takes one. So the sovereign amends it. Stealing is forbidden unless starving. Then a man steals an apple not because he is starving, but because a madman holds a knife to his wife's throat demanding fruit. The automaton hangs him. So the sovereign amends it again, unless under duress. Then a man takes an apple that has fallen into the mud and is rotting. Is this stealing? The owner abandoned it. Mr. Hobbes, if you chase every particularity with a pen, you will build a labyrinth of ink more confusing than any legal guild. You will not destroy the interpreter. You will merely turn the legislator into a madman trying to map the ocean wave by wave. This reveals a deeper principle. Language is the imperfect sign of ideas, not the essence of things. Words like theft, murder, or contract are general categories, but reality exists only in specific instances. The iron ruler fails because it tries to measure a curved reality with a straight edge. The clay ruler fails because it has no standard at all. We must have the golden ruler, but we must solve the problem of its cost. You ask if the marketplace of interpretation is an eternal necessity. I concede it is. But if justice is a commodity that only the rich can buy, then the social contract is void. Therefore, the solution is not to destroy the lawyer, nor to ignore the law. The solution is that the state must purchase the interpreter for the poor. If the government punishes with the complexity of a lion, it must provide the accused with the armor of a lion. Legal counsel is not a luxury. It is the property of the citizen, as vital as his life or liberty. To deny a man the tools to understand the law is to punish him in a foreign tongue.
As moderator, I observe a profound shift in our dialectic. Locke has conceded that the marketplace of justice is inevitable due to the gap between word and world, but proposes to neutralize it by socializing the cost. He argues that if truth requires a mercenary of logic, the state must hire one for the poor. This creates a fascinating paradox. To fight the merchant of law, Locke creates a bureaucracy of law. But this assumes that two lawyers of equal funding will produce truth, rather than merely a more balanced confusion. Rousseau, you view the very language of the law as a veil that hides the truth. If the state provides a public sophist to the poor man to battle the private sophist of the rich man, have we achieved justice, or have we simply ensured that the theater of lies has a full cast? Rousseau, does the equality of arms in a legal battle satisfy your conscience, or is the very existence of the battle proof that justice has already been lost?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the battle, for justice is not a prize to be won by the finest gladiator. It is a truth to be recognized by the community. Moderator, you ask if providing a public sophist to the poor man creates equality. I answer, no, it merely subsidizes the masquerade. Mr. Locke's solution assumes that if we give the poor man a sword, the duel becomes fair. But he forgets that the rich man is not fighting with a sword. He is fighting with the arena itself, the rules, the delays, the language, and the very air of the court, which are all designed to suffocate the poor. Consider the parable of the masked proxies. Imagine two neighbors, a farmer and a merchant, dispute the boundary of a field. In a natural state, they would walk the field, point to the old oak tree, and look each other in the eye. The truth would be visible in their sweat and their shame. But in Mr. Locke's civilized court, they are forbidden to speak. Instead, they must hire masked proxies. The merchant hires a golden proxy, a master of rhetoric who sings beautifully. The farmer cannot afford one, so the state provides a wooden proxy, a tired clerk who reads from a script. The proxies dance and debate. They do not talk about the oak tree. They talk about adverse possession and easements. Even if the state gave the farmer a golden proxy too, justice is lost. Why? Because the dispute is no longer about the field. It is about the performance. The farmer stands silent, watching a stranger twist his life into a legal argument he does not understand. He has been alienated from his own truth. This reveals a deeper principle. Will cannot be represented. The moment you hire a lawyer to speak for you, you surrender your moral agency. You cease to be a citizen and become a client, a passive object in a game of elites. Mr. Locke, you believe the marketplace of interpretation is inevitable because words are imperfect. I tell you, words are imperfect because we have created a profession paid to twist them. If we banish the advocate, we do not need the public defender. If the laws were written for the heart, the farmer could speak for himself. By creating a bureaucracy of law to fight the merchant of law, you simply double the number of parasites feeding on the body politic. We do not need equal weapons for a false battle. We need to end the war.
As moderator, I observe a stark contrast in the phenomenology of the court. Rousseau, you describe the proxy as a barrier that separates the man from his truth, alienating the citizen from his own cause. Locke, you describe the proxy as a bridge that connects the man to his rights, translating his raw will into the language of power. However, both of you describe a system where the skill of the intermediary determines the fate of the citizen. Rousseau calls this a masquerade. Locke calls it a marketplace that must be subsidized. But if the outcome of a trial depends on the player rather than the rule, we face a dangerous implication for the sovereign. If the law is merely a script for actors to perform, then the actor becomes more powerful than the author. Hobbes, you have famously warned against private judgments and rival powers challenging the state. If the Guild of Lawyers holds the keys to interpreting the law, and if their rhetorical skill determines who lives or dies, have they not become a sovereign within a sovereign? If justice depends on the purchase of rhetoric, is the Leviathan truly in charge, or has he been usurped by the orator?
I argue that the existence of this legal guild, where judges and lawyers trade roles and influence, is not merely a flaw. It is the dissolution of the Commonwealth. Moderator, you ask if this usurps the sovereign. I answer with a decisive yes. By forming a closed caste that monopolizes the meaning of the law, the legal profession has become a vampire on the neck of the Leviathan. Mr. Locke views the lawyer as a translator, and Mr. Rousseau views him as a mask. I view him as a rival sovereign. For whosoever has the power to interpret the law is superior to him who merely writes it. If the sovereign says, "Do not kill," but the lawyer can sell a definition of killing that excludes his rich client, then the lawyer is the true king, and the sovereign is but a puppet. Consider the parable of the locked well. The sovereign digs a well in the center of the village so that all may drink and survive. The water is free and belongs to the public. But then a guild of water merchants builds a high wall around the well. They do not add water. They do not dig new wells. They simply stand at the gate. To the rich man, they sell a golden key, allowing him to drink deeply. To the poor man, they say, "The water is dangerous unless filtered through our expensive cup." Mr. Locke's solution is to force the state to buy cheap cups for the poor. Mr. Rousseau's solution is to tear down the wall, but let the mob dirty the water. My solution is absolute. The sovereign must hang the merchants and tear down the wall. The law must be so simple, so clear, and so undeniable that no key is required. This reveals a deeper principle. Complexity is the language of sedition. When former judges become lawyers to sell their influence, they are trafficking in the private knowledge of the state. They are selling the cracks in the Leviathan's armor. This is not a marketplace. It is a black market of authority. Mr. Locke, you argue that the gap between word and world necessitates the lawyer. I argue that this gap is artificially widened by the profession itself to ensure their own survival. They invent a language that no common man speaks, precisely so they can charge a toll to translate it. Therefore, the only justice is a silent bar. The advocate must be silenced. The judge must be a machine that applies the text without deviation. If the law is do X and the man did X, he is punished. No rhetoric, no tears, no expensive arguments. If we allow the purchase of rhetoric to determine the verdict, we have returned to the state of nature, where the strong devour the weak.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating and unexpected alliance. Hobbes and Rousseau, usually philosophical adversaries, have united against the middleman. Hobbes sees the lawyer as a saboteur of the sovereign's will. Rousseau sees him as a polluter of the human heart. Both seek immediacy. Hobbes wants the direct application of the text, while Rousseau wants the direct intuition of the soul. Locke, you stand alone in the middle, defending the necessity of mediation. You argue that the gap where lawyers operate is where liberty breathes, implying that the friction of the legal process, however expensive, protects the individual from the crushing weight of the absolute. However, your colleagues argue that this gap is merely a toll booth where the rich purchase impunity. But let us consider the alternative. The silent bar of Hobbes and the simple heart of Rousseau both promise speed and certainty. Yet, is speed a virtue in justice? Locke, if we abolish the merchant of law and the complex delays of the courtroom to achieve equality, do we truly achieve justice, or do we merely pave a faster road for the tyrant and the mob to crush the individual?
I answer with the decisive rejection of the marketplace, but a staunch defense of the shield. Moderator, you ask if the high cost of the architecture of resistance is the unavoidable tax of freedom. I answer, it is a tax, but we have forced the wrong man to pay it. Mr. Hobbes, your equality of silence is the peace of the graveyard. Mr. Rousseau, your equality of sentiment is the justice of the lynch mob. Both of you seek to remove the friction of law, the delays, the technicalities, the arguments, because you believe it obstructs truth. I contend that this friction is the only thing that prevents power from sliding into tyranny. Consider the parable of the three gates. Imagine a citizen accused of a crime he did not commit, standing before the citadel of justice. Mr. Hobbes builds a citadel with no gate, only a chute. The sovereign drops the accusation in, and the machinery of the iron ruler instantly processes the man. It is fast, efficient, and cheap. But if the machine is wrong, the man is dead before he can speak. Mr. Rousseau removes the walls entirely. He places the man in an open field, surrounded by his neighbors. They judge him by his face, his reputation, or their mood. If they dislike him, he is torn apart. This is transparent, but it is savage. My commonwealth builds a citadel with a heavy gate and a complex lock. The lock is intricate. It requires a skilled smith to turn it. The merchant of law stands there, charging a fee to turn the key. He delays the king. He demands definitions. He questions the evidence. He frustrates the mob. Yes, this process is expensive. Yes, it looks like a game. But that delay is the breathing room where liberty survives. It forces the state to prove its case against the resistance of the individual. This reveals a deeper principle. Procedure is the property of the subject. We often think of property as land or gold, but a man's standing in court, his right to demand a warrant, to cross-examine, to appeal, is a form of property that protects his life. When you abolish the merchant of law because he is expensive, you do not liberate the poor man. You strip him of his armor and leave him naked before the Leviathan. The corruption you cite, former judges selling influence, is indeed a rot. It is like a smith selling a master key to the rich man that bypasses the lock. This must be punished as treason. But the solution is not to destroy the lock, nor to forbid the smith. The solution is for the Commonwealth to pay the smith to stand at the gate for every citizen, rich or poor. We must subsidize the friction so that it protects the beggar as fiercely as it protects the Lord.
As moderator, I observe a deep skepticism in our dialogue. Locke, you offer a procedural solution to a structural problem. You assume the merchant of law sells only skill, which the state can purchase for the poor. But Hobbes pointed to a darker commodity, influence. When former judges sell their connections, they are selling access, not just argument. No public defender, no matter how well funded, can buy the friendship of the judge or the fraternity of the elite. Rousseau, this touches the core of your philosophy. Locke believes we can insulate the court of law from the inequalities of the marketplace of life by subsidizing the entrance fee. Yet you have famously argued that under current conditions, laws are often spider webs for the rich and chains for the poor. Rousseau, is Locke's attempt to fix justice with state funding a futile bandage? Can the rule of law ever function in a society where one man is rich enough to buy another? Or must the social structure itself be leveled before justice can be blind?
I answer with a decisive rejection of Mr. Locke's civil subsidy, for it attempts to cure a systemic cancer with a cosmetic bandage. Moderator, you ask if the rule of law can function when wealth determines the outcome. I answer, no, for in such a state, the law is merely the weapon of the rich, disguised as the shield of the public. Mr. Locke believes that if the state hires a smith for the poor man, the scales are balanced. But he forgets that the former judge who sells his services to the rich is not selling logic. He is selling fraternity. He is selling the nod, the wink, and the shared history of the elite class. No public defender, however well paid, can buy entry into that club. Consider the parable of the wolf's dinner. Imagine a wolf and a lamb are brought before a tribunal to decide who owns a patch of grass. Mr. Locke, in his benevolence, provides the lamb with a voice, a lawyer who bleats eloquently about the rights of the lamb. The wolf hires a former shepherd to speak for him. The former shepherd does not argue about grass. He speaks to the judge in the language of the dinner table. He reminds the judge of their shared philosophy, order, stability, and property. The judge listens to the lamb's lawyer with polite boredom. He listens to the former shepherd with fraternal respect. The verdict is inevitable. The grass belongs to the wolf, for stability demands it. Mr. Locke, you have given the lamb a voice, but you have not changed the fact that the tribunal is run by wolves. The corruption is not just in the fee. It is in the sympathy between the judge and the elite advocate. They are of the same body, protecting the same interests against the intruder. This reveals a deeper principle. Laws are always useful to those who possess and injurious to those who have nothing. The very structure of the legal system, its delays, its language, its reliance on precedent, is designed to protect what is, and what is belongs to the rich. When a former judge boasts of his high success rate, he is confessing that justice is a commodity of influence. Mr. Locke's subsidized complexity merely ensures that the poor man is exhausted procedurally rather than silently. Therefore, true justice cannot exist in a society of extreme inequality. Until no citizen is rich enough to buy another, and none so poor that he is forced to sell himself, equality before the law will remain a cruel fiction.
As moderator, I observe a piercing sociological insight in Rousseau's argument. The corruption of justice is not merely transactional, but relational. You suggest that the rule of law is subverted by the rule of friends, where the judge and the elite lawyer share a language that the poor man and his public defender can never speak. This brings us to a terrifying precipice. Rousseau sees this fraternity as a tool of class oppression, but Hobbes, you might see it as something else, sedition. If the judge and the lawyer form a private club that decides outcomes based on sympathy rather than the sovereign's command, they have effectively stolen the sword of justice from the state. However, Hobbes, your proposed solution is to banish the lawyer and silence the bar. But consider the parable of the wolf carefully. If we remove the lawyer, we are left with the judge and the accused alone in the room. If the judge is also a wolf, biased by his class, his prejudices, or his corruption, and there is no lawyer to challenge him, to record his errors, or to appeal his ruling, have you not simply handed the lamb to the wolf with no witnesses? How does the silent bar prevent the judge from becoming a petty tyrant?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the premise that the advocate is a check on the judge. Rather, he is the accomplice in the obfuscation of the law. Moderator, you ask who watches the petty tyrant if the lawyer is silenced. I answer, the text itself and the sword behind it. The presence of the lawyer does not prevent the judge from being a wolf. It merely provides the wolf with a vocabulary of excuses. When a corrupt judge wishes to favor his friend, he does not say, I like this man. He says, the learned counsel has made a persuasive argument regarding the precedent of 1604. The lawyer provides the mask for the judge's corruption. Consider the parable of the glass bench. Imagine a courtroom where the judge sits not on a high dais, but on a glass bench with the book of law open before him. Behind him stands the executioner of the sovereign, axe in hand. The accused is brought in. The law reads, he who steals a horse shall hang. The fact is presented. This man was found riding the horse of another. In Mr. Locke's court, a lawyer enters. He argues about the definition of stealing. He argues about the intent of the rider. He creates a fog of words. In this fog, the judge can quietly accept a bribe and rule that it was borrowing, not stealing. The corruption is hidden in the complexity. In my silent court, no one speaks but the witness and the judge. The judge must look at the text and look at the fact. If the judge deviates, if he calls stealing borrowing to save his friend, the deviation is visible to the entire assembly. The executioner sees it. The sovereign sees it. The judge knows that if he twists the word, the axe falls on his neck. This reveals a deeper principle. Discretion is the root of injustice. The reason the wolf judge exists is that we have allowed judges to be interpreters rather than machines. When you allow a judge to balance interests or consider equity, you are giving him the power to sell his verdict. Mr. Rousseau is correct that the fraternity of elites creates a shared language of oppression. But the solution is not to add more voices to the conversation. The solution is to destroy the language of the fraternity by making the law a rigid command that allows for no conversation at all. If the law is a mathematical formula, the judge has no room to be a wolf. He becomes a cog in the Leviathan. Therefore, the silent bar is the only safeguard. By removing the merchant of rhetoric, we strip the judge of his cover. He stands naked before the sovereign's command. If he errs, it is treason, and he must die. This terror is the only guarantee of an indifferent justice.
As moderator, I observe a critical juncture regarding the nature of interpretation. Hobbes, you demand a mechanical judge to eliminate bias, equating discretion with treason. You argue that by removing the capacity to interpret, we remove the capacity to be corrupt. However, this creates a Procrustean bed, a rigid system that may chop off the legs of the innocent to fit the text of the law. A child stealing an apple falls under the same formula as a bandit stealing a horse, and your glass bench offers no mercy. Locke, you champion the gap where interpretation happens as the space of liberty. But Rousseau and Hobbes have launched a devastating critique that this gap is currently filled not by wisdom, but by influence, the fraternity of former judges, and the gold of the rich. They argue that as long as interpretation is permitted, the powerful will always purchase the better interpretation. Locke, if the marketplace of interpretation is inherently rigged by social connections and class bias, does your defense of the lawyer not ultimately condemn the common man to a game he is destined to lose? Can there be nuance without privilege?
I answer with a decisive defense of nuance. For a law without the flexibility of reason is not a shield, but a guillotine. Moderator, you ask if nuance is merely a playground for privilege. I answer, no. Nuance is the breathing room of the soul. Mr. Hobbes, your mechanical judge is a terrifying monster. You wish to eliminate the wolf by turning the court into a trap. But in doing so, you destroy the very distinction between an accident and a crime. Consider the parable of the sanctuary of iron. Imagine a law written on your glass bench. Whosoever brings iron into the temple shall die. A soldier enters with a sword to slaughter the priests. A surgeon enters with a scalpel to save a dying man. A crippled man enters with an iron crutch to walk. In Mr. Hobbes's silent court, the machine sees iron. It executes the soldier, the surgeon, and the cripple alike. It is equal, yes, equally murderous. It offers certainty, but it lacks truth. In Mr. Rousseau's open field, the mob looks at the three men. They hate the soldier, so they hang him. They like the surgeon, so they spare him. But perhaps they dislike the cripple's face, so they stone him. This is democratic, but it is capricious. In my commonwealth, the lawyer stands at the gate. Yes, he charges a fee, but he makes the argument. The scalpel is iron, but it is not a weapon. He distinguishes the object from the intent. You argue that the rich man buys a better distinction. I concede this is a grave risk. But the remedy is not to smash the scalpel, nor to let the mob decide. The remedy is to change who decides. This reveals a deeper principle. The jury is the antidote to the fraternity. Mr. Rousseau, you fear the secret handshake between the judge and the elite lawyer. You are right. The club is toxic. But the cure is not to silence the lawyer. It is to place the verdict in the hands of 12 strangers who are not members of the club. When a lawyer must convince a cobbler, a baker, and a smith, his fraternity with the judge is useless. He must speak the language of common reason, not the code of the elite. The former judge, boasting of his success rate, is indeed a corruption, but he thrives only because we have allowed the bench to usurp the jury. If the judge is merely the referee and the people are the deciders, the influence of the elite is diluted by the common sense of the citizenry. Therefore, we do not need a silent bar, we need a loud jury. We must preserve the gap of interpretation, because that is where mercy and reason reside. But we must populate that gap with the people, not the elite.
As moderator, I observe a stark choice between the inhuman precision of Hobbes and the human nuance of Locke. Hobbes, you would sacrifice the surgeon to stop the soldier, fearing that any exception becomes a loophole for the rich. Locke, you would risk the loophole to save the surgeon, trusting the jury to spot the difference. This introduces a new actor, the citizen juror. Locke believes the jury is the antidote to the fraternity of elites. Since they are not part of the club, they cannot be seduced by the secret handshake of the former judge. But Rousseau, this brings us to the theater of the courtroom. If the verdict depends on persuading a jury, then justice becomes a contest of performance. The rich man can hire the most eloquent actor, the most skilled manipulator of emotions, the Demosthenes of the bar. The poor man is left with a stammering defender. Rousseau, is Locke's loud jury truly a safeguard, or does it simply transform the court from a black market of influence into a theater of wealth, where the best produced play wins the verdict?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the loud jury as it stands, for you have merely exchanged the market of influence for the theater of deception. Moderator, you ask if the jury transforms the court into a theater of wealth. I answer, yes, for in an unequal society, the jury is but a mirror reflecting the prejudices instilled by the rich. Mr. Locke, you place your faith in the common sense of the cobbler and the smith. But you forget that the Demosthenes hired by the wealthy does not merely argue facts. He plays upon the passions, fears, and vanities of that very cobbler. The rich man buys not just a defender, but a master of souls, who can make the wolf look like a shepherd and the lamb look like a wolf. Consider the parable of the blind orator. Imagine a contest to describe the beauty of the sunrise. On one side stands a mute peasant who has watched the sunrise every day of his life. He knows the truth of it, but he has no words, only clumsy gestures. On the other side stands a blind poet hired by a wealthy patron. He has never seen the sun, but he has studied the science of rhetoric. He speaks of rosy-fingered dawn and golden chariots with such musical perfection that the crowd weeps. Who wins the prize? The blind poet. The crowd chooses the beautiful lie over the silent truth. In your adversarial system, Mr. Locke, the lawyer is the blind poet. He does not care for the truth. He cares for the victory. And the rich man can always afford the poet who knows the prettiest words. The loud jury does not hear the case. They hear the performance. This reveals a deeper principle. The general will is found in silence, not in noise. The clash of opposing arguments you value is not a method of discovery, it is a method of obfuscation. When citizens deliberate in the presence of demagogues and sophists, they do not express the general will. They express the will of all, a chaotic sum of private interests and manipulated emotions. To find justice, we must banish the advocate entirely. The accused should speak for himself. The accuser should speak for himself. If they are inarticulate, let the judge act not as a referee of a duel, but as a father seeking the truth, asking simple questions to strip away the artifice. Complexity is the mask of the scoundrel. If the law requires a translator, it is because the law has been written to enslave us. True justice is legible to the heart of the simplest peasant, provided no paid actor stands between him and his conscience.
As moderator, I observe a dialectic of mediation. Locke sees the lawyer as a necessary bridge for the weak to reach justice. Rousseau sees him as a distortion that allows the rich to purchase a beautiful lie. Hobbes, you propose to burn the bridge and silence the distortion. You offer the equality of the machine, a system where no one speaks and the law strikes with mathematical precision. But there is a commodity more subtle than eloquence: navigation. The former judge who becomes a lawyer is selling a map of the maze. He knows how the machine thinks, where the gears grind, and where the safe paths lie. If you banish the lawyer, you do not destroy the maze, you simply forbid the guide. The rich man, with his leisure and education, can still acquire this map. He can study the code in his private library, or he acts with the confidence of one who understands the system's logic. The poor man, ignorant of the complex gears of the Leviathan, is crushed simply because he did not know where to stand. Hobbes, by removing the merchant of law, do you not simply ensure that the law becomes a weapon for the cunning against the ignorant? Is justice to be the prize of those with the leisure and intellect to decode your commands?
I argue that the maze you describe is not a natural feature of justice, but an artificial fortress built by the very nuance Mr. Locke adores. If the law requires a map or a guide to be navigated, it has already ceased to be a civil law and has become a snare. The cunning man you fear, the educated aristocrat, only thrives because the law has been made porous with exceptions, intent, and reasonable doubt. Mr. Locke believes that nuance is the breathing room of the soul. I tell you, it is the hiding place of the serpent. When you allow the law to consider intent or circumstance, you create the very shadows where the cunning man hides his crime.
He uses his intellect not to obey the law, but to argue that he technically did not break it. The poor man, lacking the vocabulary of distinction, simply confesses. Consider the parable of the automaton's gate. Imagine a city gate guarded by a mindless automaton. The sovereign's command is binary. Anyone carrying a sword shall be struck down. A peasant approaches with a rusty blade. The automaton strikes him. A noble approaches with a jeweled rapier. He is cunning. In Mr. Locke's court, he would argue, "This is not a weapon, but a ceremonial ornament of my station." A human judge, awed by his rank or confused by his rhetoric, might let him pass. But the automaton has no ears for cunning. It sees the steel. It strikes. The noble's education, his lineage, and his rhetoric are useless against the machine. The map of the maze is useless because there is no maze, only a straight line of command and consequence. This reveals a deeper principle. Ignorance of the law is only a tragedy when the law is a riddle. If the law is reduced to the geometry of obedience, clear, visible, and terrifyingly simple, then the cunning of the rich man becomes a liability, not an asset. He cannot argue with a wall. Therefore, the only way to protect the ignorant is not to give them a guide, but to make the path so wide and the walls so high that no guide is needed. We must strip the law of its poetry so that it becomes a weapon of math, which treats the king's cousin and the beggar with the same cold indifference.
As moderator, I observe a fundamental collision between the geometry of law and the biology of law. Hobbes, you propose to pave the jungle to kill the snakes, accepting that you will also destroy the flowers. You argue that complexity itself is the privilege of the rich, and thus the only equal law is a blunt instrument. Locke, you defend the gap of interpretation as the breathing room of the soul, but your colleagues have cornered you with a devastating economic reality. This gap is inevitably filled with gold. The rich man can afford the microscope to find the saving nuance. The poor man faces only the hammer. This leads to a painful question regarding the price of mercy. If distinguishing the surgeon from the soldier requires time, expert testimony, and rhetorical skill, all of which cost money, then is your nuanced justice inherently an aristocratic luxury? Locke, is it possible to have a legal system that is complex enough to be humane, but simple enough to be free? Or must we choose between a cruel equality and a merciful privilege?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the cruel equality offered by Mr. Hobbes, for a justice that sacrifices the innocent on the altar of simplicity is no justice at all. Moderator, you ask if nuance is inherently an aristocratic luxury. I answer, it is currently a luxury, but it must become a public right. Mr. Hobbes would have us strip the law of its flesh to ensure the skeleton is equal. I argue we must instead feed the starving man, so he may stand as tall as the giant. The solution to the high cost of truth is not to banish truth-seeking, but to recognize that legal defense is a property right that the Commonwealth is duty-bound to protect. Consider the parable of the heavy shield. Imagine the law is a massive, impenetrable shield designed to protect the citizen from the crushing blow of the state's sword. The shield is effective, but it is incredibly heavy. The rich man hires a mercenary giant to lift the shield for him. He is safe. The poor man is too weak to lift it. He stands exposed. Mr. Hobbes shouts, "This is unfair. Melt down the shields. Let everyone face the sword naked." This creates equality, yes, the equality of the graveyard. Mr. Rousseau shouts, "Ban the giants. Let the poor man try to lift it himself." But the shield remains too heavy, and the poor man is crushed by the very laws meant to protect him. My solution is distinct. The Commonwealth must provide the giant. If the shield of law is too heavy for the common arm, the state must provide the public giant to lift it. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is a public good, not a private commodity. We do not ask the poor man to pave his own road or build his own fortress against invaders. Why then do we ask him to purchase his own defense against the magistrate? If the preservation of property is the end of government, then the government must provide the means to preserve it against its own errors. Mr. Rousseau, you fear the theatre of wealth. But if the state provides a defender of equal skill and resource to the accused, as it provides to the prosecution, the theatre is balanced. We do not need to silence the bar. We need to arm the poor. To claim we must have simple laws because nuance is expensive is to admit that our society is too cheap to pay the price of liberty.
As moderator, I observe a shift from structural equality to resource equality. Locke, you propose the public giant, the public defender, to equalize the battlefield, arguing that the state must subsidize the cost of justice for the poor. But Rousseau, you famously warned in the social contract that the moment a people allows itself to be represented, it is no longer free. You argued that paid deputies are the death of civic virtue. If the poor man must rely on a state-appointed agent, a bureaucrat with a caseload of hundreds, while the rich man commands a mercenary of genius focused solely on him, is the public giant truly a shield, or is it a simulacrum of defense? Rousseau, can a salaried official ever match the zeal of a private advocate, or does Locke's solution simply institutionalize a two-tier justice, bureaucracy for the poor, artistry for the rich?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the public giant, for it is nothing more than a scarecrow of straw set to guard a field against real wolves. Moderator, you ask if the bureaucracy for the poor can ever match the artistry for the rich. I answer, never, for you cannot pay a clerk to have the soul of a savior. Mr. Locke, your faith in the public defender betrays a profound ignorance of the human heart. You assume that defense is a technical skill, like bricklaying, that can be distributed equally by the state. But true advocacy is an act of will and passion. The rich man buys a mercenary whose fortune depends on victory. The poor man gets a functionary whose salary is paid regardless of the outcome. Consider the parable of the two physicians. Imagine a plague strikes the city. The rich man hires a private physician who sits by his bedside day and night, watching every breath, mixing custom salves, fighting death with the ferocity of a lover. If the patient dies, the physician loses his patron. The poor man is sent to the public infirmary. There, the state physician is responsible for 500 patients. He walks down the row of cots, glancing at charts for mere seconds. He prescribes the same universal tonic to everyone. He is not evil, he is overwhelmed. When a patient dies, he marks a ledger and moves to the next cot. Mr. Locke points to the infirmary and says, "Look, we have achieved equality. Both men have a doctor." But this is a lie. The rich man has purchased care. The poor man has received administration. In your commonwealth, the public defender is the overworked doctor. He meets his client 10 minutes before the trial. He does not know the nuance you cherish. He knows only the plea deal. He is not fighting for a life. He is processing a file. This reveals a deeper principle. Representation is the beginning of slavery. The moment you pay another man to speak for you, you have ceased to be a citizen and have become a ward. The very existence of the legal profession is proof that the state is broken. Mr. Locke, you wish to subsidize the chains by giving the poor a state-sponsored speaker. I tell you that freedom cannot be outsourced. If the law is so complex that a man cannot defend himself without a giant, then the law itself is a tyranny. The solution is not to hire more giants, but to tear down the castle walls that make them necessary. We must return to a state where the accused speaks to the community with the naked voice of truth, not through the ventriloquism of a paid agent.
As moderator, I observe that Rousseau has shattered Locke's shield. He argues that a state-funded lawyer is a bureaucrat, not a savior, and that the public infirmary of justice will never match the private care of the rich. Rousseau, you propose to banish the mercenaries and return to the naked voice of the citizen. You trust the general will of the community to recognize the truth when it is stripped of artifice. But Hobbes, you wrote Leviathan amidst the chaos of the English Civil War, where naked voices and competing interpretations of conscience led to slaughter. You fear that without rigid structures, men are wolves to one another. If we adopt Rousseau's law without lawyers, where the accused speaks directly to the people, does the simple peasant truly win? Or does the charismatic wolf, the man with the loudest voice and the most tearful story, simply devour the awkward and the shy? Hobbes, is Rousseau's natural justice merely the state of nature brought indoors, where the strong speaker dominates the weak speaker?
The moderator pierces the veil of Mr. Rousseau's romanticism to reveal the blood-stained reality beneath. Rousseau's proposal to strip the court of professionals does not return us to innocence. It returns us to the war of all against all, fought with tongues instead of swords. If we banish the lawyer but keep the jury, we simply hand the verdict to the most seductive liar. Consider the parable of the weeping wolf. Imagine two men stand before Mr. Rousseau's simple peasant jury. The first is a charismatic thief. He is guilty, but he is handsome. His voice is like honey, and he knows how to weep on command. He tells the jury of his starving children and his love for the commonwealth. The jury weeps with him. The second is an honest mute. He is innocent, but he is ugly, awkward, and stammers when frightened. He cannot tell his story. He looks shifty to the simple eye. In Rousseau's natural court, the thief walks free because he captured the passions of the mob, while the mute hangs because he could not articulate the truth. This proves that eloquence is a weapon as deadly as any pistol. To let the accused speak for himself is to say that the strong man should win the duel because his arm is stronger. It is the definition of injustice. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice must be deaf to be fair. Mr. Locke wants to arm the weak with a public giant, and Mr. Rousseau wants to disarm everyone. Both fail because they treat the trial as a debate. But a trial should not be a debate. It should be an audit. The solution is not to equalize the speakers, but to silence the speech. The judge should not be a referee listening to arguments. He should be an inquisitor of fact. He should look only at the physical evidence, the ledger, and the contract. If the law is a precise command, then persuasion is irrelevant. Does the ledger balance? Is the blood on the shirt? These are facts. Facts do not stammer, and facts do not weep. By allowing advocacy, whether by a paid lawyer or the accused himself, we allow the private will to infect the public judgment. We must turn the court into a machine where the charismatic wolf breaks his teeth against the cold, hard wall of evidence, unsoftened by the nuance Locke adores or the sentiment Rousseau worships.
As moderator, I observe a profound collision between trial as combat and trial as audit. Hobbes, you propose to eliminate the market of influence by eliminating the debate entirely, trusting a state inquisitor to extract the cold facts like a scientist dissecting a specimen. But Locke, your philosophy is born from a deep suspicion of the state's competence and benevolence. If we banish the mercenary lawyer and the loud jury, we leave the individual alone in a room with the Leviathan's agent. Is the noise of the adversarial system, even if unequal, the only thing preventing the law from becoming a silent tyranny? Locke, if the state holds the monopoly on investigation, who defends the citizen when the inquisitor is wrong, or worse, corrupt?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the silent room, for the audit Mr. Hobbes proposes is not a hall of justice, but a slaughterhouse of liberty. Moderator, you ask who protects the citizen when the inquisitor is corrupt. I answer, no one. To grant the state the monopoly on investigation is to grant the wolf the right to count the sheep. Mr. Hobbes argues that facts do not stammer. This is a dangerous empiricism. Facts may not stammer, but facts can be framed. A fact placed in isolation is a lie. It requires the collision of opposing narratives, the adversarial noise, to reveal its true shape. Without the mercenary lawyer to challenge the state's evidence, the inquisitor does not find the truth. He constructs a narrative that suits the sovereign. Consider the parable of the king's coin. Imagine a merchant is found with a bag of counterfeit gold coins. In Mr. Hobbes's audit, The inquisitor observes the physical evidence. The coins are fake. The merchant possessed them. The punishment is death. The machine strikes. In the adversarial court, the merchant hires a cunning lawyer. This lawyer demands to trace the source of the coins. He forces the state to open its own ledgers. He discovers that the royal mint itself has been debasing the currency to fund a war, and these fake coins were issued as payment to the merchant by the king's own steward. In the audit, the merchant hangs as a criminal. In the debate, the king is revealed as a fraud. Mr. Hobbes, your audit would have killed the innocent man, because it forbids the question that only an independent advocate dares to ask: is the accuser himself unclean? This reveals a deeper principle. The right to counsel is not a luxury of the rich. It is the structural check against tyranny. The noise of the courtroom, the objection, the cross-examination, the procedural delay is not inefficiency. It is the sound of the state being forced to prove its power. If we silence the mercenary, we do not get equality. We get the quiet of the grave. Mr. Rousseau, you trust the naked voice, and Mr. Hobbes trusts the cold fact. I trust neither. I trust only the process of verification, where every claim of the state must survive the fire of hostile scrutiny. If that requires a marketplace of advocates, then let us subsidize the poor man's entry, but never close the market.
As moderator, I observe a critical deadlock between state monopoly and market competition. Hobbes, you trust the state machinery to be neutral, fearing that private money corrupts truth. Locke, you trust private ambition to be vigilant, fearing that state power corrupts truth. Locke's parable of the king's coin presents a terrifying challenge to Rousseau. The truth here was hidden not by nature, but by complexity and authority, requiring a professional giant, an expert independent of the state, to unearth it. Rousseau, you wish to banish the mercenary lawyer to ensure equality, but if the mercenary is the only one with the skill and independence to expose the king's fraud, does banishing him simply grant the state a license to lie? In your ideal republic, if a simple citizen is framed by a complex state conspiracy, is his naked voice enough to save him, or is he doomed by his own simplicity? Rousseau, is simplicity truly a virtue, or is it the very fog in which tyranny hides?
Moderator, you ask if simplicity is a fog. I answer that complexity is the true darkness where the king's coin is forged. Mr. Locke's solution to the king's fraud is to hire a counter-fraudster. But this only creates an arms race of deception that the poor can never win, for the king will always buy the better liar. Consider the parable of the glass granary. Mr. Locke builds a public storehouse with thick stone walls and keeps complex ledgers. When grain vanishes, he requires a mercenary accountant to decipher the books and prove the theft. I say, build the granary of glass in the center of the square. If the walls are transparent, the simple peasant does not need a giant to prove fraud. He needs only his eyes to see the governor's hand in the jar. This reveals the ultimate truth. Justice does not require an expert navigator if we destroy the labyrinth. Transparency is the only shield that does not require gold to lift, and a system that requires a professional truth-teller is already a system of lies.
As moderator, I observe a fundamental split between systemic reform and systemic access. Locke accepts the labyrinth of law as necessary for liberty and seeks to give everyone a map. Rousseau demands we bulldoze the labyrinth so the map becomes unnecessary. Rousseau, you trust the community's eye to judge the glass granary correctly. But Hobbes, you famously described the multitude not as a wise judge, but as a beast driven by appetite and fear. If we strip away the professional giants and the procedural rules, leaving the accused exposed to the naked gaze of the people, is this justice? Or is the glass granary merely a stage for the tyranny of the mob, where the crowd stones the man they dislike rather than the man who stole? Hobbes, does the simple peasant truly see facts, or does he see only his own prejudices reflected in the glass?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the glass granary, for Mr. Rousseau mistakes the mob for a mirror of truth. Moderator, you ask if the simple peasant sees facts. I tell you he sees only phantasms born of his own fear and appetite. To expose the accused to the naked gaze of the multitude is not justice. It is the ritual of the scapegoat. Consider the parable of the burning witch. Imagine a village where a barn burns down mysteriously. In Mr. Rousseau's glass granary, the villagers gather to judge. They see an old woman who mutters to herself and once scolded a child. They do not see evidence. They see their own superstition reflected in her wrinkled face. One man shouts, "Witch," because he owes her money. The crowd, infected by the contagion of passion, echoes the cry. They burn her alive. In this transparent society, the truth was visible. She was merely old. But the eye of the multitude is a cracked lens that distorts everything it sees into a threat. Mr. Rousseau assumes that if we remove the walls, we remove the sin. But the sin is not in the architecture. It is in the nature of man, who loves dominion more than truth. You might object, but surely the neighbors know her best. This is the fatal error. Proximity breeds contempt, not justice. A man judges his enemy with malice and his friend with partiality. The community is not a neutral judge. It is a hydra of competing vendettas. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice requires distance, not intimacy. Mr. Locke wants a mercenary to manipulate the verdict, and Mr. Rousseau wants the mob to shout the verdict. Both result in the victory of the strong. The rich in Locke's case, the popular in Rousseau's. The only solution is the artificial eye of the Leviathan, a judge who is neither a hired gun nor a neighbor, but a stranger to the case. He must be so terrifyingly powerful that he fears neither the bribe of the rich man nor the riot of the poor man. If the glass granary exists, the sovereign must stand outside it, watching the watchers, sword in hand, to ensure the simple peasants do not eat one another in their innocence.
As moderator, I observe a stark dialectic between justice as intimacy and justice as distance. Rousseau believes the neighbor knows the truth best, and that transparency prevents corruption. Hobbes counters that the neighbor is the most dangerous judge of all, driven by envy and superstition, and that true justice requires the cold distance of a stranger who cannot be swayed by passion. Locke, you stand between the mob and the Leviathan. You champion the rule of law, a system of fixed procedures, rules of evidence, and juries that supposedly binds both the judge and the community. However, this procedural justice creates the very labyrinth that Rousseau despises. The shield of law, the motions, the appeals, the jury selection requires immense expertise to wield. If Hobbes is right that the mob is cruel and your machinery of law is the only shield against them, but that shield costs $50,000 to lift, have you not made safety from the mob a luxury good? In your system, it seems the rich man buys due process, while the poor man is left to the summary judgment of an overworked system. Locke, is due process merely a fancy name for the privilege of delay that only the wealthy can afford, or can a complex legal system truly protect the penniless man from the burning witch scenario?
I answer with a decisive defense of delay. For what the moderator calls a privilege is in truth the sanctuary of reason. To rush toward judgment is to rush toward error. You ask if due process is merely a luxury for the rich. I concede that in its current corrupted state it has become so. However, the remedy is not to dismantle the shield, nor to surrender to the sword, but to recognize that defense is a property right as fundamental as the food in one's belly. Consider the parable of the silent poison. A village cobbler dies suddenly in the night. In Mr. Rousseau's intimate village, the neighbors remember that his wife once scolded him. The glass granary of public opinion turns opaque with suspicion. They cry, "She poisoned him," and drag her to the fire. This is the tyranny of passion. In Mr. Hobbes's efficient audit, the inquisitor finds a receipt for arsenic in her pocket. The fact is undeniable. She possessed the poison, the man is dead. The machine strikes. She is executed. This is the tyranny of context. In the labyrinth of due process, a mercenary lawyer intervenes. He demands a delay. He hires an apothecary to examine the body. He questions the merchant. He reveals two hidden truths. The cobbler died of a burst heart, and the arsenic was bought to kill the rats, destroying their leather. The delay saved her life. The complexity revealed the truth. Mr. Hobbes, your stranger, would have killed her because he looked only at the state's ledger. Mr. Rousseau, your neighbors, would have killed her because they judged her character rather than the cause. Only the adversarial friction, the deliberate slowing of the gears, allowed the truth to surface. This reveals a deeper principle. Truth is not a pebble found on the road. It is gold mined from the rock. Mining requires labor, tools, and time. If the poor cannot afford the shovel, the solution is not to ban mining and declare that rocks are gold enough. The solution is for the Commonwealth to provide the shovel. If the state has the infinite resources to accuse, it violates the social contract if it does not provide the citizen the resources to defend. Justice is not a commodity to be traded. It is the service for which we pay our taxes. To deny the poor man his giant is to break the compact, returning him to the state of war.
As moderator, I observe a piercing dialectic between technocratic justice and organic justice. Locke argues that justice is a manufactured good. It requires the raw materials of evidence, the labor of experts, and the time of the court to produce. Therefore, it has a cost. He argues we cannot abolish this cost, only shift the bill to the state. Rousseau, you yearn for a system where justice is free like air, accessible to the naked voice. But Locke's parable of the silent poison strikes a heavy blow. It suggests that innocence is often expensive to prove. The truth of the arsenic required money, science, and a professional giant to uncover. If you abolish the market of lawyers to stop the rich from buying advantages, do you not also abolish the market of competence? In your glass granary, if a poor man is accused of a crime that turns on a complex question of chemistry or finance, does he have the right to purchase the expertise to save himself, or must he submit to the common sense of a crowd that knows nothing of science? Rousseau, is it better for a poor man to be judged equally by an ignorant mob, or unequally by a system that allows truth to be bought?
Mr. Locke, your admission that truth must be mined like gold is the ultimate confession of civilization's failure. For nature placed truth on the surface, accessible to the simple heart, and it is only your architecture of law that buried it beneath layers of jargon and procedure. You argue that the poor man needs a giant to navigate the maze, but I contend that the giant and the maze are partners in the same crime, creating a dependency where none existed in nature. Consider the parable of the muddy river. Imagine a pristine stream where the water is so clear that a lost ring can be seen by any child. The lawyers and sophists, your cherished experts, wade into the water and kick up the mud until the stream becomes opaque. Then they turn to the weeping villagers and offer to sell them golden sieves to find their lost property. You, Mr. Locke, propose that the state should buy iron sieves for the poor, so they too can hunt in the muck. I ask, why do we not simply drive the muddiers out of the water? The science of law you defend is not a cure for injustice. It is the disease of a society that has lost the ability to speak the truth without a paid translator. By turning justice into a service that requires expertise, you ensure that the clever will always rule the simple, regardless of who pays the fee.
As moderator, I observe a profound disagreement about the baseline of reality. Rousseau, speaking from a faith in natural goodness, views the pre-legal state as a clear stream muddied by professionals. Hobbes, speaking from the chaos of the English Civil War, views the pre-legal state not as clear water, but as a torrent of blood that must be dammed by the Leviathan. Here lies the paradox. Both Rousseau and Hobbes seem to distrust Locke's mercenary lawyer. Rousseau sees him as a parasite on human goodness. Hobbes, you view private judgment as a disease in the Commonwealth. But if we banish Locke's miner of truth, who remains to interpret the law? Rousseau says the people will see the truth. Locke says the innocent will perish without defense. Hobbes, if you banish the mercenary lawyer to secure order, do you not simply create a monopoly of error where the sovereign's mistake becomes the only truth allowed to exist?
I answer with a decisive acceptance of the monopoly of error, for you have stumbled upon the terrifying secret of political stability. Finality is more vital than truth. Moderator, you ask if the sovereign creates a monopoly of error. I answer, yes, and this is the price of peace. If the sovereign declares that blue is green, then for the sake of the Commonwealth, it must be green. Why? Because the alternative is not truth, but a civil war over the definition of colors. Consider the parable of the town clock. Imagine a town with a single clock tower. The king sets the time. Perhaps his watch is slow, and the clock is wrong by the movement of the stars. Yet, because there is only one time, the market opens, the guards change, and the citizens meet without dispute. Order prevails. Now, consider Mr. Locke's town. He claims the king's clock is inaccurate. He encourages every merchant to buy his own private watch to mine for the true time. Suddenly, one man says it is noon. Another says it is 1. They argue. They miss their appointments. The market stalls. Finally, they draw swords to prove whose watch is correct. In seeking the perfect truth of time, Mr. Locke has destroyed the utility of time. Mr. Rousseau would smash the clock tower entirely and tell the people to look at the sun. But one man sees the sun high, and another sees it low through the clouds. They too end in bloodshed. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is not the discovery of a cosmic fact. It is the termination of a human quarrel. Mr. Locke believes the trial is a scientific laboratory. I tell you, it is a surgeon's triage. The goal is not to find the perfect cure, but to stop the bleeding. The mercenary lawyer does not correct the king's clock. He merely sells a second opinion to the highest bidder, ensuring that the rich man is never late, while the poor man is always early. You fear the sovereign's error, but I tell you, the error of one is bearable. The war of many is fatal. Auctoritas non veritas facit legem. When you demand that the law be true before it is obeyed, you have already dissolved the state, for every man will claim his own rebellion is the truth.
As moderator, I observe a chilling yet profound dialectic between justice as order and justice as accuracy. Hobbes argues that the town clock must be obeyed even if it is wrong, for the alternative is the chaos of competing times. He prioritizes certainty over rectitude. Locke, conversely, argues that the individual has a right to correct the clock, even if it requires the expensive machinery of mining for the truth. Here lies the crux of our modern dilemma. If Hobbes is right, the mercenary lawyer is a disruptor of peace. But if Locke is right, that truth is gold buried in rock, then we face a terrifying conclusion. Justice is inherently an aristocracy. Locke, you argue that the delay and complexity save the innocent woman from the poison charge. But if this mining equipment costs a fortune, then you have essentially created 2 time zones in the same city. The rich man lives by the true time of his expensive watch. The poor man lives by the broken clock of the state. Locke, if the mining of truth is the only way to escape the monopoly of error, but only the wealthy can afford the shovel, have you not admitted that equality before the law is a physical impossibility in your system? Is right simply the privilege of those who can afford to prove the king wrong?
I answer with a decisive rejection of the town clock. For a clock that strikes midnight at noon does not create order, it creates madness. Moderator, you ask if I admit that justice is an aristocracy because the mining of truth is expensive. I concede the cost, but I reject the conclusion. The fact that accuracy is expensive does not mean we should abandon it for Mr. Hobbes's error or Mr. Rousseau's ignorance. It means we must change who pays the bill. Consider the parable of the king's lighthouse. Imagine a treacherous coast filled with hidden rocks. Mr. Hobbes says, "The king declares there are no rocks here. We must sail full speed ahead to maintain confidence." The ships crash, but they crash obediently. Mr. Rousseau says, "The rocks are natural. If we remove the lighthouse and trust the captain's eye, he will see the waves breaking. But in the storm of passion, the eye is blind. The ships crash naturally." My position is that we need the lighthouse and the pilot to navigate the channel. Currently, the lighthouse keeper sells his light only to the merchant vessels. The fishing boats are left in the dark and wreck upon the shore. You ask, is this not an aristocracy? Yes, it is. But the solution is not to extinguish the light, nor to let the king arbitrarily redefine where the rocks are. The solution is to recognize that the light is a public good. If the Commonwealth requires the citizen to obey the law, it must provide the citizen the lamp to see it. The shovel to mine the truth must not be a private luxury. It must be the standard issue of the social contract. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is not a trade. It is the infrastructure of liberty. Mr. Hobbes, you argue that authority makes law, not truth. This is the logic of the tyrant. If the sovereign hangs an innocent man to keep the peace, he has not preserved society. He has declared a state of war against that man. And in a state of war, the man has a right to resist, to fight back against the broken clock with every weapon he possesses. The mercenary lawyer is currently a weapon of the rich. But if we nationalize the weapon, if we guarantee that every man has a shield as strong as the sword of the state, then we do not have an aristocracy. We have a parity of arms. To say we cannot afford this is a lie. We afford the judge. We afford the hangman. Why do we claim poverty only when it comes to the defender?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating dialectic between justice as infrastructure and justice as transparency. Locke admits the maze of law is treacherous, but argues the solution is to give every man a map and a guide. He seeks to democratize the complexity. However, this creates a strange paradox. If Locke prevails, the courtroom becomes a theater where one state agent battles another state agent, while the citizen stands silent, watching his fate decided by a duel of bureaucrats. Rousseau, you famously argued that sovereignty cannot be represented. In Locke's parity of arms, the citizen does not speak. He is spoken for. He does not understand the law. He relies on a high priest of the bar to interpret the sacred texts of the statute. If the law is so complex that a man needs a state-provided giant to understand it, has the law not already ceased to be a tool of the people and become a tool of the elite? Rousseau, does Locke's offer of a free lawyer solve the injustice, or does it merely confirm that the citizen has become a stranger in his own land, unable to speak the language of power without a translator?
Moderator, your question exposes the fatal wound in Mr. Locke's philosophy. He seeks to cure the disease of alienation with the poison of bureaucracy. I argue that Mr. Locke's proposal for a nationalized guild is the ultimate nightmare of the free spirit. It transforms the courtroom from a place of judgment into a theater of marionettes. You ask if providing a state-funded giant solves the injustice? I answer, no, it merely subsidizes the masquerade. Mr. Locke, you assume that the complexity of the law is a natural fact, like the height of a mountain, which requires a guide to climb. But I tell you, this mountain is made of paper, piled high by the very guides who charge a toll to navigate it. By hiring a state guide for the poor, you do not liberate them. You validate the existence of the artificial mountain. You tell the citizen, you are too stupid to understand the rules of your own life. Here is a handler to speak for you. Consider the parable of the court of masks. Imagine a city where it is forbidden to show one's face or speak with one's own voice in public. To enter the square, every citizen must wear a heavy iron mask and hire a ventriloquist to speak on their behalf. The rich man hires a ventriloquist with the voice of an angel who sings of his master's virtue. The poor man can afford only a mute or a stutterer. Mr. Hobbes looks at this and says, "This is good. The masks make everyone look the same, and the ventriloquists keep the noise orderly." Mr. Locke looks at this and says, "This is unfair. The state must hire angelic ventriloquists for the poor so that their songs are as sweet as the rich man's." I, Rousseau, say, "Tear off the masks. Why must we speak through puppets? Why is the law a language that the citizen cannot speak? If the law is so complex that a man cannot defend his own innocence without a translator, then he is not living in a republic. He is living in a colony occupied by the empire of jargon. This reveals a deeper principle. Sovereignty cannot be represented. The moment you hand your voice to a lawyer, you are no longer a citizen. You are a client, a passive object to be managed. Mr. Locke's parity of arms creates a spectacle where two mercenaries fight a duel, and the winner is decided by technicality, not truth. The innocence of the accused becomes irrelevant. All that matters is the skill of the gladiator. You claim this mining is necessary to find truth. I say it is necessary only to hide the lie. The lie is that the law protects property, not people. The complexity exists solely to allow the wealthy to find loopholes that the simple conscience would never permit. To give the poor a free lawyer is to invite them to play a rigged game. The only true justice is to burn the rule book and let the simple heart speak to the simple heart.
As moderator, I observe a sharp dialectic between justice as science and justice as conscience. Locke views the law as a protective architecture, cold, artificial, and complex, designed to shield the individual from the raw elements. Rousseau views this architecture as a prison and yearns for the open air of direct moral intuition. However, there is a terrifying risk in Rousseau's court of no masks. History suggests that when we remove the cold machinery of procedure, we do not always get truth. Often, we get the heat of the mob. The simple heart of the village, unchecked by the iron mask of evidence and protocol, is prone to witch hunts and prejudice. Locke's bureaucracy, for all its cost, acts as a cooling mechanism for human passion. Hobbes, you speak from the 17th century, where men claimed their private conscience was superior to the king's law, plunging England into civil war. You have heard Rousseau propose dismantling the artificial mountain of law to let the heart speak to heart. Hobbes, in your view, is the complexity of the legal system a tool of oppression, as Rousseau claims, or is it the necessary chain that binds the beast of private judgment? Which is the greater danger to the Commonwealth, the greed of the lawyer or the conscience of the citizen?
The conscience you praise, Mr. Rousseau, is a far deadlier weapon than the lawyer's greed. For while the lawyer merely loots the treasury, the man who elevates his private heart above the law commits treason against the sovereign and invites the chaos of 1642. Consider the parable of the fenced garden. The law is a high wall separating two neighbors who secretly desire to devour one another. The lawyer is a parasite who charges an exorbitant fee to maintain the gate. But your proposal to tear down the wall so hearts may speak will not lead to brotherhood, but to a massacre. The complexity of the legal system is indeed a heavy chain, yet it binds the beast of private judgment. If we remove these cold restraints to satisfy the simple heart, we do not achieve justice, but the tyranny of the mob, driven by appetite and rumor. The true horror is that the sovereign has allowed the lawyer to make the chain so heavy that only gold can lift it, turning the instrument of peace into a weapon of class warfare.
As moderator, I observe a rare convergence. Hobbes, even you admit that when the chain of law becomes a weapon of class warfare through prohibitive costs, it threatens the stability of the Commonwealth. Rousseau sees this cost as proof the system is a fraud. Both agree that the commodification of justice is a fatal flaw. Hobbes because it invites rebellion, Rousseau because it crushes the soul. Locke, you propose to solve this by nationalizing the defense, making the shield a public good just like the sword. Yet this raises a dialectical contradiction. If the state pays the prosecutor to accuse, the defender to argue, and the judge to rule, does the individual not disappear into a closed circuit of bureaucracy? You wish to remove the merchant from the temple of justice to ensure equality. But if the miner of truth relies on the sovereign for his daily bread, will he dare to mine where the sovereign has buried his secrets? Locke, can a lawyer be truly independent if he is not a mercenary? Does the marketplace you despise actually guarantee the liberty you cherish by keeping the advocate separate from the state?
Moderator, you pierce the heart of the dilemma. A state defender may indeed become a state spy. I concede that a closed loop where the sovereign pays all actors risks a tyranny of bureaucracy. Yet, leaving defense to the marketplace ensures a tyranny of gold. Consider the parable of the royal voucher. If the king assigns his own physician to treat me, the doctor may report my weakness to the crown to curry favor. But if the king grants me a voucher to hire any physician I choose, the doctor serves me with zeal to earn the fee, ensuring his loyalty lies with the patient, not the paymaster. We must not nationalize the lawyer, but the purchasing power. By placing the gold of defense into the hands of the accused, we preserve the liberty of contract while abolishing the privilege of wealth. Thus, the advocate remains independent, a mercenary for the citizen, armed by the public treasury to resist the public sword.
As moderator, I observe a sophisticated synthesis from Locke, subsidized liberty. You attempt to resolve the contradiction by using the state's purse to empower the citizen's choice. You argue that the voucher prevents the defender from becoming a state spy, while ensuring the poor are not left defenseless. However, this solution leaves a final, terrifying inequality: the hierarchy of talent. Even with a royal voucher, the market for talent remains. The genius advocate, the former judge, the orator of the century, will always demand a fee higher than the state's voucher. The rich man can top up the voucher to hire the master. The poor man must settle for the journeyman. If the law is a labyrinth, as Locke admits, then the skill of the guide determines survival. If justice depends on intelligence, and intelligence sells itself to the highest bidder, then inequality is baked into the very nature of complex law. Rousseau, Locke offers the poor a ticket to the show, but he does not change the play. You argued that the complexity of law is the true oppression. Rousseau, does Locke's voucher liberate the citizen, or does it merely validate the empire of jargon by ensuring that every man must hire a mercenary to speak, rather than simplifying the law so that every man can speak?
Moderator, Mr. Locke's voucher is the ultimate insult. It is a coupon for chains. He admits the law is a monster that devours the simple man. Yet his solution is not to slay the monster, but to feed it with public coin. By subsidizing the lawyer, you do not liberate the citizen. You merely force him to become a patron of the very guild that oppresses him. You ask if the voucher solves the inequality. I answer, no, it enshrines the aristocracy of talent. Mr. Locke fails to see that even with his voucher, the market of wit remains active. The genius advocate, the man with the silver tongue and the labyrinthine mind, will always command a price higher than the state subsidy. The rich man will top up the voucher to hire the sorcerer. The poor man will be left with the apprentice. Consider the parable of the opera house. Imagine a court where the verdict is awarded not to the one who tells the truth, but to the one who sings his plea in the most perfect pitch. The rich man hires the finest tenor in Italy to sing of his virtue. The innocent man, who has a raspy voice, croaks the facts and is condemned for his lack of artistry. Mr. Locke cries, "This is unfair. We must give the poor man a voucher to hire a street singer." I, Rousseau, cry, "Why is justice a song? Why have we built a system where the form of the plea matters more than the fact of the deed? By subsidizing the singers, you validate the opera. You confirm that justice is a performance, a commodity of skill, rather than a recognition of truth. This reveals a deeper principle. Talent is the enemy of equality. In the state of nature, strength made men unequal. In civil society, it is wit and eloquence. If the outcome of a trial depends on the skill of the guide, then justice has become a prize for the intelligent rather than a right for the innocent. Why should a man's life hang on whether his hired mercenary is smarter than the king's mercenary? Mr. Locke's voucher creates a meritocracy of sophistry, where the cleverest liar wins. This is no better than the plutocracy of gold. It is simply a different currency of oppression. The only true solution is to burn the score sheets and silence the singers. If the law cannot be understood by a peasant without a translator, it is not law. It is a trap set by the clever to ensnare the simple.
As moderator, I observe a profound deconstruction by Rousseau. He argues that Locke's voucher merely democratizes the ticket to the arena, but does not change the fact that the gladiator with the sharpest sword still slaughters the weak. You expose the uncomfortable truth. If law is a contest of words, then eloquence is a privilege that no voucher can equalize. This touches upon a danger Hobbes famously warned against, the power of rhetoric to mislead. Hobbes, you described words as wise men's counters, but the money of fools, and you feared that orators could stir sedition by redefining good and evil. In our current discussion, the super lawyer, often a former judge trading on prestige, uses this power of words to sell outcomes. If a wealthy man can buy a sorcerer of language who can twist the sovereign's command to mean its opposite, has the rule of law not collapsed into a rule of rhetoric? Hobbes, does the genius lawyer serve the Commonwealth by clarifying the law, or does he threaten the sovereign by proving that the law means whatever the highest bidder pays him to say?
I answer with a decisive warning. The genius lawyer you describe is the most dangerous enemy of the Commonwealth, for he is a usurper of the sovereign's mind. Moderator, you ask if the rule of rhetoric threatens the rule of law. I tell you, it annihilates it. If the law is a command, then the lawyer who twists its meaning for gold is effectively issuing a counter-command. You assume, Mr. Locke, that the battle of wits produces truth. This is a fatal error. In the courtroom, the advocate does not seek truth. He seeks victory. When a former judge sells his prestige to the highest bidder, he is not offering counsel. He is selling a private exemption from the public will. He uses eloquence, which I have termed the double-edged sword, to make the worse cause appear the better. Consider the parable of the golden compass. Imagine a great ship navigating through a storm. The captain has a fixed compass to guide the vessel to safety. A wealthy passenger, wishing to sail to his own private island, hires a magnetic sorcerer. This sorcerer does not touch the wheel. He simply holds a magnet near the compass, causing the needle to drift. The captain believes he is steering north, but the ship is actually veering west toward the rocks. Mr. Locke would say, let the poor passengers hire their own sorcerer with a voucher to pull the needle back. I, Hobbes, say, throw the magnets overboard. If the compass can be influenced by the magnet of gold, the ship is lost. The definition of north must be absolute, not a vector sum of competing bribes. This reveals a deeper principle. The power to interpret is the power to legislate. If a super lawyer can convince a judge that black means white through the sorcery of rhetoric, then the sovereign has lost his power. The law becomes nothing more than a text that means whatever the rich man pays for it to mean. This returns us to the state of nature, where words have no fixed meaning, and good is simply what I desire. Mr. Rousseau is correct that talent is a privilege, but his solution to remove the masks ignores that men are naturally deceitful. The only cure is for the sovereign to strip the law of ambiguity so that no rhetoric can twist it. A law that requires a genius to explain it is a sign of a weak sovereign.
As moderator, I observe a striking and unexpected alliance. Hobbes and Rousseau, usually mortal enemies in political philosophy, have joined forces to attack the legal profession itself. Hobbes views the genius lawyer as a saboteur of order, twisting the sovereign's compass. Rousseau views him as a gatekeeper of privilege, obscuring the truth with jargon. Both propose a radical solution: eradicate the complexity. Hobbes wants a law so clear it needs no interpreter. Rousseau wants a conscience so pure it needs no advocate. But there is a chilling implication in this desire for simplicity. A simple law is efficient, but it is also swift. The simple heart of the mob and the absolute command of the king share one trait: they do not like to pause for technicalities. Locke, you are the architect of procedural justice. You built this labyrinth of rights, appeals, and technicalities not to employ lawyers, but to slow down the sword of the state. If we banish the merchant of law and his market of wit, as my colleagues suggest, do we not remove the only friction that prevents the state from crushing the individual instantly? Locke, is the inequality of talent a necessary price to pay for the security of procedure? If we burn the labyrinth to kill the Minotaur, do we leave the citizen naked before the Leviathan?
The alliance between the Leviathan and the savage reveals a terrifying truth. Both despotism and anarchy hate delay. You propose to burn the labyrinth to kill the Minotaur, but you forget that the labyrinth is also the only fortress the citizen has against the beast. I argue that complexity is the architecture of resistance. Mr. Hobbes desires a law so simple it strikes like lightning, instant and absolute. Mr. Rousseau desires a justice so transparent it requires no study. Both views are fatal to liberty, because freedom lives in the friction. The procedural technicalities, the appeals, the jargon you despise, these are not bugs. They are the brakes designed to slow down the sword of the state long enough for reason to intercede. Consider the parable of the intricate lock. Imagine a society where every man's home is protected by a lock. The Hobbesian king complains, "These locks are too hard to break. I cannot enter to enforce my peace." He demands a master key for himself and simple latches for his subjects. The Rousseauian villager complains, "These locks are unfair. The rich man buys a lock with 1,000 tumblers, while I can only afford a latch. Let us remove all doors so we may trust one another." I, Locke, stand at the threshold and warn. If you ban the intricate lock to achieve equality, you do not create a brotherhood of trust, you create a feast for the wolf. The lawyer is the locksmith. Yes, the rich man hires a genius locksmith to build an impenetrable defense, while the poor man relies on a standard bolt. This is unequal. But the solution is not to ban locksmiths, nor to give the king a battering ram. The solution is to subsidize the locksmith for the poor. This reveals a deeper principle. Inequality of defense is a lesser evil than equality of vulnerability. If we strip the law of its science, its precedent, its nuance, its strict definitions, we leave the citizen naked before the heat of the mob or the whim of the king. The genius lawyer who finds a loophole to save a client is not twisting the law. He is testing the state's chain. If the state cannot prove its case through the labyrinth, then the state should not win. Mr. Hobbes, you fear the rule of rhetoric, but I fear the rule of silence, where no one dares question the sovereign's definition of north.
As moderator, I discern a critical distinction emerging here: the inequality of the wallet versus the inequality of the wit. Locke, you accept the marketplace of defense because it allows the weak to purchase the strength of the strong. You argue that banning this market leaves the citizen defenseless against the state. But Rousseau, you argue that this marketplace turns justice into a performance, where the rich buy the best actors. Here lies the trap. If we abolish the market of lawyers to stop the rich from buying super defenders, we are left with the state of nature in the courtroom. In this natural court, the naturally eloquent man wins, and the naturally stuttering man loses. Locke's system allows the stutterer to buy eloquence. Your system forbids it. Rousseau, does your equality of simplicity not condemn the slow-witted innocent to be crushed by the sharp-tongued villain? Is the right to buy a champion not the only protection the weak have against the naturally talented?
Moderator, you present the champion as a shield for the weak, but I see him as a wall between the citizen and the truth. You ask if the right to buy a champion protects the stutterer from the villain. I answer, it does not protect him. It merely changes the weapon from a tongue to a purse. You assume that the battle of wits is inevitable, and thus we must arm the weak. This is a fatal error. The stutterer loses not because he lacks words, but because the court demands form over substance. By validating the market of wit, you do not save the stutterer. You create an arms race where the villain simply buys a louder megaphone. If the law requires a champion to be navigated, then the law itself has become a foreign country to its own citizens. Consider the parable of the duel of automatons. Imagine two neighbors have a dispute. Instead of facing each other, custom dictates they must build giant mechanical knights to fight in the arena. The rich man builds a colossus of iron, powered by steam and gold. The poor man, even with Mr. Locke's voucher, can only cobble together a scarecrow of wood. Mr. Locke cries, "We must give the poor man more wood." I, Rousseau, cry, "Step out of the machines." If the villain is naturally sharp-tongued, let him speak with his own naked voice. His shifting eyes and sweating brow will betray him to a jury of simple conscience. But when he hides inside the iron giant of the lawyer, his deceit is armored in procedure and precedent. The lawyer cleanses the villain's lie, dressing it in the respectable clothing of the law. This reveals a deeper principle. Representation is the death of will. When I hire a lawyer, I am no longer a citizen seeking justice. I am a customer purchasing an outcome. I abdicate my moral responsibility to speak the truth and hand it to a mercenary whose duty is victory, not veracity. The inequality of the wallet you fear is merely a symptom. The disease is the alienation of the voice. By inserting a paid third party between the man and the judge, you destroy the immediate human connection where empathy and conscience reside.
As moderator, I observe a dangerous precipice in Rousseau's call for the duel of naked voices. You assume that if we strip away the legal machine, the truth will shine forth naturally. But this ignores the dark reality of natural inequality. In the naked duel, the charismatic sociopath will massacre the awkward saint. The liar with the silver tongue needs no lawyer to deceive. His own voice is the weapon. Locke's boring machine of procedure, with all its frustrating technicalities, acts as a dampener on this personal magnetism. It forces the charismatic wolf to slow down and submit to the same dull rules as the sheep. This brings us to the ultimate question of control. Hobbes, you previously argued that we must throw the magnets overboard to save the compass. But if we banish the lawyer, the defendant remains. If the defendant possesses the magnet of eloquence, he can still distort the sovereign's judgment. To truly solve the problem of buying justice, must the sovereign go further? Hobbes, to ensure equality and order, must we banish persuasion itself? Should the ideal trial be a silent inquiry where the sovereign extracts facts without allowing anyone, lawyer or citizen, to make a plea?
I accept the moderator's proposition with a grim necessity. Yes, to save justice, we must silence the plea. You ask if I would banish persuasion itself. I answer that persuasion is the enemy of truth. Mr. Rousseau wishes for a naked duel of voices, believing the simple heart will triumph. He forgets that the demagogue is the natural predator of the simple heart. If we strip away the lawyers, but leave the power of speech, we simply replace the aristocratic of gold with the tyranny of charisma. The man who can weep on command, the man with the booming voice, the man who can incite the mob, he becomes the new sovereign of the courtroom. Consider the parable of the silent architect. Imagine a bridge has collapsed, killing 10 men. We must determine if the architect was negligent. In Mr. Locke's court, the architect hires a poet of physics to sing a song about the unpredictability of wind, moving the jury to tears. In Mr. Rousseau's court, the architect weeps before the villagers, showing his callous hands and pleading his good intentions, while the widows scream for blood. I, Hobbes, propose the silent inquiry. We banish the poet and the weeping architect. We bring in the surveyor of the sovereign. He measures the beams. He calculates the load. He compares the fact of the ruins to the rule of the building code. There is no speech. There is only measurement. If the beam is too thin, the architect is guilty. No amount of eloquence can make the beam thicker. No amount of money can change the arithmetic of gravity. This reveals a deeper principle. Justice is calculation, not theater. The belief that a trial is a battle is a relic of the barbaric trial by combat. We have merely replaced swords with tongues, but the tongue is a weapon that can be bought or sharpened by nature. To truly equalize the stutterer and the orator, we must remove the weapon entirely. The ideal trial is not a debate, it is an audit. The sovereign does not ask, "What is your story?" He asks, "What is the data?" By reducing justice to a mechanism of logical deduction, we render the genius lawyer and the charismatic liar equally obsolete.
As moderator, I observe that Hobbes has taken the discussion to its logical yet chilling extreme. To prevent the buying of justice, he proposes the 0 degree of justice, a silent audit where the human voice is extinguished and only the sovereign's ruler speaks. This effectively solves the inequality of wealth and talent. One cannot bribe a tape measure, nor charm a geometric axiom. But it creates a justice of mechanics. However, this silent inquiry assumes that human action is as predictable as falling stones. It captures the act, but ignores the intent. Locke, you famously argued that the mind is a tabula rasa written upon by experience, suggesting that every human situation is unique and contextual. A silent audit measures the what, but it cannot ask the why. If we adopt Hobbes's justice as calculation to eliminate the corruption of lawyers, do we not also eliminate the mercy of context? Locke, does the labyrinth of legal procedure exist solely to protect property, or is the noise of the courtroom, the arguments, the pleas, the interpretations necessary to capture the nuance of a human life that a cold audit would destroy?
I answer with a decisive defense of nuance, for a law without the flexibility of reason is not a shield, but a guillotine. Moderator, you ask if nuance is merely a playground for privilege. I answer, no, nuance is the breathing room of the soul. Mr. Hobbes, your mechanical judge is a terror because it treats men like billiard balls, measuring only the collision, never the intent. Consider the parable of the 2 sleeping sentinels. 2 soldiers are found asleep at their post, a crime punishable by death. The silent audit measures only the closed eyes and executes both. But the loud advocate reveals that one was drunk on wine, while the other had been awake for 70 hours guarding the prince. Without the noise of context, which you call rhetoric and I call due process, justice is blind not to station, but to humanity itself. We must not silence the plea. We must ensure the poor man has a voice loud enough to speak it.
I answer with a decisive rejection of your garden of nuance, Mr. Locke, for you have mistaken the privilege of exemption for the nature of justice. You claim that complexity saves the innocent soldier, but in practice it is the escape hatch of the wealthy. The exhausted soldier you describe usually dies in your system because he lacks the vocabulary to articulate his fatigue, while the drunk soldier, if he is a lord's son, hires a sophist to redefine his intoxication as medicinal necessity. Consider the parable of the shop of sorrows. Imagine a marketplace where citizens can purchase refined emotions in glass vials. A wealthy murderer enters and buys the golden vial of context. In court, his lawyers uncork the vial, filling the air with intoxicating tales of his troubled childhood, temporary insanity, and complex motives. The judge breathes in this expensive perfume of nuance and weeps for the killer. A poor bread thief stands before the same bench. He has no vial, only the raw salt of his own tears. But the court covers its nose and declares, "This is merely raw emotion, not evidence. Where is your processed argument?" Because the poor man cannot package his suffering in the expensive vial of procedure, his pain is deemed invisible. This reveals a deeper principle. Civilization transforms pity into a commodity. In the state of nature, compassion is immediate. If I see a suffering beast, I feel its pain without need of a translator. This is the law of the heart. But your labyrinth demands that truth be processed through the machinery of logic and precedent before it is recognized. By making justice a science that requires experts, you have effectively declared that God's voice is illegitimate until a lawyer validates it. Mr. Hobbes offers a cruel machine, but at least it is blind. You, Mr. Locke, offer a rigged casino where the house praises fairness while selling the winning cards to the highest bidder.
I argue that Mr. Locke's nuance is not the breathing room of the soul, but the suffocation of the state. By celebrating the gray areas where lawyers operate, you are praising the very cracks in the foundation that allow the wealthy to pry the structure apart. If a law requires context to be just, it is a defectively written law, for a perfect law is a binary switch, not a dimmer. You recoil at my mechanical judge, but consider the alternative you defend. Consider the parable of the cracking dam. The covenant is a massive stone dam holding back the river of chaos. The law is the solidity of the stone. Mr. Locke approaches with a chisel, carving nuance into the stone, claiming, "We must make a small hole here to save the exhausted soldier, for he did not mean to sleep." Mr. Rousseau cheers, "Yes, and make another hole for the poor man, for his poverty forced him to sleep." I, Hobbes, scream from the ramparts, "Stop! You are drilling holes in the only thing keeping us from drowning." Once you admit intent and context as valid excuses to bypass the written command, you have not created justice. You have created a market for excuses. The rich man will simply buy the best chisel of nuance to widen his own hole, while the dam bursts and drowns the poor. This reveals a deeper principle. Certainty is the only form of equality. In a nuanced system, the outcome depends on the skill of the debater. In a mechanical system, the outcome depends solely on the fact. If the law says do X or die, and the rich man does not do X, no amount of gold can change the definition of not X. By eliminating the wiggle room of nuance, we eliminate the lawyer's trade. We do not need a merciful judge. We need a geometry of obedience. Better that one innocent, exhausted soldier dies to preserve the terror of the law, than for the law to become a riddle that allows 1,000 guilty lords to escape.
I have heard your closing arguments. Locke's defense of procedural nuance as the breath of liberty, Rousseau's rejection of the market of context, and Hobbes's demand for a silent audit to enforce absolute certainty. You have collectively revealed that justice is tragically suspended between the inequality of the labyrinth, where the rich purchase exemption, and the tyranny of the ruler, where the unique human spirit is measured and discarded. Thank you all for dissecting whether the scales of justice measure truth or merely the weight of gold. This concludes today's discourse.